The Keeper of Secrets. Chapter 1. The morning Eldridge woke to find the bookstore, Mrs. Catherine Hendricks was already 3 cups of coffee deep into her daily ritual of watching the town decay from her kitchen window. She'd been performing this particular form of self-torture for 43 years, ever since her husband Gerald had put his service revolver in his mouth and redecorated their bedroom ceiling with what remained of his war memories. The abandoned Kellerman building had squatted on the corner of Main and Birch for the better part of 2 decades, its boarded windows like dead eyes staring accusingly at anyone foolish enough to make eye contact. Old Henrik Kellerman had hanged himself in that building's basement back in '98, driven mad by whispers he claimed came from the walls themselves. Catherine had grown accustomed to its presence, the way one grows accustomed to a tumour, acknowledging its existence without truly seeing it anymore. Which is why the pristine storefront that now occupied that corner made her coffee cup slip from arthritic fingers and shatter against the linoleum floor. "Jesus Christ on a cracker," she whispered, pressing her face against the glass until her breath fogged the window. The words came out in a wheeze that tasted of instant coffee and 40 years' worth of morning disappointments. Where the Kellerman building had rotted away like a bad tooth, something impossibly clean now stood. The storefront gleamed with fresh paint, the colour of dried blood, and gold lettering spelled out "The Keeper of Secrets" in an elegant script that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. A small brass bell hung above the door, swaying in a breeze that touched nothing else on the street. Catherine's hands shook as she reached for her phone, muscle memory dialing her sister's number. "Dolores, you need to look outside. Right now." "Cat, it's barely 7 in the morning." "The Kellerman building. It's gone." A pause. Footsteps. Curtains being drawn. Holy Mary, Mother of God. By 8:30, a small crowd had gathered across the street, maintaining the careful distance of prey animals who'd caught an unfamiliar scent. Tom Brewster, who'd been delivering mail to the same 23 routes for 15 years, stood with his bag clutched against his chest. "Wasn't here yesterday." His voice carried the authority of someone who knew every crack in every sidewalk. "Building was boarded up, same as it's been since Kellerman's death." "Buildings don't just appear overnight," said Margaret Flores, though her voice wavered. She'd been the town librarian for 37 years, and she prided herself on facts and their proper arrangement. Yet here she stood, staring at an impossibility that made her stomach clench with vertigo. The bookstore seemed to breathe in the morning light. Its windows, too clean, too perfect, reflected not the street before it, but something else entirely. Brief glimpses of movement that might have been shadows. The brass bell continued its lazy swing, though the morning air hung still as a held breath. "Look at the foundation," whispered Pete Kowalski, pointing with a trembling finger stained yellow from 40 years of cigarettes. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming despite the cool morning air. They could all see it now, the impossible marriage of ancient and new, as if the building had been grafted onto existing reality with surgical precision. The ivy clung to walls that shouldn't exist, and the sidewalk ran seamlessly to the store's entrance without so much as a colour variation in the concrete. Margaret fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking badly enough that she nearly dropped it. "Maybe we should call the police." "And tell them what?" Tom's laugh came out sharp. "That reality's gone and gotten itself rearranged." As if summoned by their growing unease, the bookstore's door opened with a sound like wind through dead leaves. The brass bell gave a single clear chime that seemed to resonate not through the air, but through the bones of everyone present. A woman emerged. She was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, though her age seemed to shift like smoke when observed directly. Her hair was silver white and pulled back in a severe bun that revealed a face marked by sharp beauty and careful cruelty. She wore a black dress that seemed to drink in the morning light, and her pale hands were adorned with rings that caught the sun and threw it back in colours that had no names. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of somewhere far away and long ago. "I am Madame Ilara, and I am so pleased to finally meet you all." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. She knew them. Somehow, impossibly, she knew them all. "Mrs. Hendricks." Her gaze found Catherine with surgical precision. "I have something that belonged to your husband, something he left behind." Catherine's breath caught. After 43 years, Gerald's name still had the power to gut her. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. The letter he wrote but never sent. The one you found in his footlocker and burned without reading. I have another copy." "That's impossible." "Mr. Brewster." Ilara continued as if Catherine hadn't spoken. "Still wondering about that package you delivered to the wrong address 17 years ago? The one that contained the adoption papers for the Hendricks boy?" Tom's face went the colour of old parchment. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Miss Flores, tell me, do you still dream about the books you removed from the library's collection, the ones deemed too dangerous for public consumption?" Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You're insane. This is some kind of trick." "Mr. Kowalski." Ilara's voice cut through Margaret's hysteria like a blade. "Your daughter didn't run away to California. She never left Eldridge at all." Pete's cigarette fell from nerveless fingers. His face had gone beyond pale into something approaching translucent, and his entire body began to tremble. "What did you say?" "The mine shaft, the old Henderson property. She's been waiting for you to find her for 23 years. The words hung in the air like a curse. Around him, the other townspeople had gone statue still, each lost in their own personal nightmare of secrets exposed. Pete doubled over, retching into the gutter. "You're lying," he whispered between heaves. "Am I? Then why don't you ask her yourself? I'm sure she'd be happy to see you." A sound rose from somewhere beneath the street, or perhaps from somewhere much deeper than that. A sound like wind through broken glass, like fingernails on stone, like the whisper of something long dead trying to remember how to speak. The townspeople scattered like startled birds, their feet carrying them away from the bookstore with an urgency that bypassed conscious thought. Only Catherine remained, frozen in place by the weight of 43 years' worth of unanswered questions. "Come inside, Catherine," Madame Ilara said gently. "It's time you learned the truth about Gerald's last day." And despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Catherine found herself walking toward the bookstore's door. This is madness, she thought. Gerald's been dead for 43 years. There are no letters. There are no secrets left. But even as her mind rebelled, her feet carried her forward. What if there is something? What if I've been wrong all these years? What if he didn't leave me because he was weak, but because he was trying to protect me from something? The brass bell chimed again as she approached, its sound echoing in harmonics that human ears were never meant to hear. Behind her, Eldridge went about its morning routine with the desperate normalcy of a town that had just discovered it was already damned. But in the windows of the Keeper of Secrets, shadows moved that cast no reflections, and books with no titles whispered secrets that should never have been written down. Something ancient had indeed awakened in Eldridge, something that had been waiting patiently in the spaces between what was real and what was merely believed to be impossible. And it was hungry. The door closed behind Catherine with the finality of a coffin lid, and the brass bell fell silent. In the sudden quiet, those who had fled could swear they heard the sound of pages turning, though no wind stirred the morning air. The bookstore settled into its new reality like a predator making itself comfortable in a fresh kill. Chapter 2. Clara Whitmore had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. The way shadows fell differently around certain houses, how some people's laughter carried notes that made her skin crawl, the subtle wrongness in her mother's eyes whenever anyone mentioned the old farmhouse that had burned down before Clara was born. She'd been working the afternoon shift at Mabel's cafe when the commotion about the bookstore began. Through the grease-stained window, she'd watched the townspeople cluster across from the mysterious building like antibodies around an infection. Their fear was palpable, thick enough to taste, but Clara felt something else entirely. A pull as inexorable as gravity, as if something behind those two clean windows was calling her name. The feeling persisted through the rest of her shift, through the careful routine of closing up, through the walk home past the bookstore that should have taken her in the opposite direction. Her feet carried her to the door marked "The Keeper of Secrets," with a will that felt distinctly separate from her own. The brass bell above the door remained silent as she entered. The air inside was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. Shelves stretched impossibly high, their contents shifting in her peripheral vision whenever she turned her head. The smell of old paper and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in a grave, filled her nostrils. "Hello?" she called, but her voice seemed to die just inches from her lips, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. No response, no sign of the woman the others had described. Clara was alone among the books, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being catalogued, assessed, measured against some unknowable standard. She wandered the aisles, running her fingers along spine after spine of volumes, with titles that seemed to blur when she looked directly at them. The deeper she went into the store, the more the whispers seemed to grow, not audible exactly, but felt in her bones, in the spaces between heartbeats. That's when it happened. A book fell from a shelf 10 feet above her head, landing at her feet with a sound like thunder in the unnatural quiet. Clara jumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the book lay innocently on the floor. Old leather binding cracked like dried mud, corners worn smooth by countless hands. The cover bore a title in faded gold letters. Whispers of the Past. No author listed, no publisher's mark. Just those 3 words that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Clara bent to pick it up, and the moment her fingers touched the leather, the world shifted. The store around her faded to grey, and for just an instant she could have sworn she smelled smoke and heard the distant sound of a woman screaming. Then it was gone, leaving only the weight of the book in her hands and the lingering scent of old violets. She opened it at random, expecting to find the usual musty pages of some forgotten novel. Instead, she found herself staring at a family tree, her family tree, drawn in brown ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Names she recognized dotted the branches: her great-grandmother Mercy, her grandmother Ruth, her mother Helen. But there were other names too, names that had been scratched out or written in a different hand, as if the tree itself had been edited and re-edited over the years. "This is impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The book felt warm in her hands, almost alive, and as she turned the pages, she found herself reading accounts of her family's history that no one had ever told her. Mercy Whitmore, born 1889, died 1934, known locally as a healer and midwife, accused of witchcraft following the death of the Hartwell child, though charges were never formally brought due to lack of evidence. Local records indicate she was seen performing rituals in the woods behind the old farmhouse, speaking in tongues, consorting with entities that cast no shadows. Clara's hands began to shake. She'd never heard of any Hartwell child. Her mother had always said Mercy died in her sleep, a peaceful death for a woman who'd spent her life helping others. She turned the page. The pact was made on the night of the harvest moon, 1912. Mercy Whitmore, desperate to save her dying infant daughter, called upon forces that should have been left undisturbed. The child lived, but the price was steep. The bloodline would be forever bound to serve, generation after generation, until the debt was paid in full. "No," Clara said aloud, but her voice was barely a whisper. The book seemed to grow heavier in her hands, and she could feel her pulse in her temples, in her throat, in the tips of her fingers where they touched the pages. The fire that consumed the farmhouse in 1956 was no accident. Helen Whitmore, pregnant with her first child, had discovered her mother's journals hidden in the root cellar. She attempted to break the pact through flame, but such bonds are not easily severed. The fire claimed her husband and nearly claimed her, but the child survived. The child always survives. Clara's breath came in short gasps. She knew about the fire. It was family legend, the tragedy that had shaped her mother's entire life. But this version was different, darker, full of details that made her stomach churn. She flipped ahead, desperate to find the end of the story, to find some explanation that didn't involve her family being cursed for generations. Instead, she found herself staring at a page that shouldn't have existed, couldn't have existed, because it was written in her own handwriting. Clara Whitmore, born 1999, called to serve 2024. The youngest yet chosen, but perhaps the strongest. The dreams began early. Visions of the burned farmhouse, of the woman who walks between worlds, of the price that must be paid for power. She will resist, as they all do. But the blood knows its purpose, and the blood will have its way. The book fell from her nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like breaking bones. Clara stumbled backward, her vision swimming, bile rising in her throat. She had to get out. She had to get away from this place, from this impossible book, from whatever madness had taken hold of her family. But as she turned to run, she found herself face to face with the book again. It lay open on a different shelf, pages fluttering as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The words on the open page glowed with a light that hurt to look at directly. You cannot run from what you are. Clara ran anyway. The book was tucked under her arm as she burst through the door of her mother's house, though she couldn't remember picking it up. Helen Whitmore sat in her usual chair by the window, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of not moving. "Mother," Clara gasped, holding up the book, "I need you to tell me about Mercy, about the fire, about what really happened to our family." Helen's eyes flicked to the book, and Clara saw something there, recognition, fear, and something else that might have been relief. "Where did you get that?" Helen's voice was steady, but her hands trembled against her lap. "The bookstore. Mother, is it true about the pact, about the curse?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond Clara's shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I burned every copy of that book I could find. I hoped it would be enough. So it's true." Clara's legs gave out, and she sank into the chair across from her mother. All of it. The witchcraft, the pact, the fire. "Your great-grandmother was a desperate woman. She made a choice that saved her daughter's life, but it bound our family to something that should never have been awakened. I tried to break free, Clara. I tried to burn it all down, but the fire only made it stronger. What does it want from us?" Helen's eyes finally met Clara's, and in them, Clara saw the weight of decades of secrets and shame. Service, sacrifice. There are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what is and what shouldn't be, and they require tending. Our family has been their caretakers for over a century, and now it's my turn. I had hoped, I prayed that it would skip you, that the bloodline would weaken enough for you to live a normal life. But when that store appeared, Helen's voice trailed off. Clara looked down at the book in her hands. It had fallen open to a new page, one that definitely hadn't been there before. The ink was still wet, glistening like fresh blood in the lamplight. The awakening has begun. The daughter is ready to learn her true purpose. The old agreements must be honoured. "Mother, what happens if I refuse?" Helen's face went pale. No one has ever refused, Clara. The blood calls, and the blood must answer. That night, Clara tried to sleep, but the book wouldn't let her. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel its presence, a weight on her nightstand, a whisper in her ear, a cold touch against her skin. She'd tried hiding it in the closet, but when she'd opened her eyes, it was back beside her bed, open to a page that simply read, "I am patient, but I am not forgiving." She'd tried burning it, but the matches wouldn't light. She'd tried tearing out the pages, but her hands wouldn't obey. The book had become part of her now, as much a part of her as her own pulse, her own breath. The dreams, when they finally came, were worse than waking. She stood in a field of ash where a farmhouse had once been, watching a woman in a white dress walk among the ruins. The woman's face was her own, but older, marked by years of terrible knowledge. Around her moved shadows that had no source, whispering in languages that predated human speech. "Welcome, sister," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "We have been waiting for you." Clara tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She tried to scream, but her voice emerged as the same inhuman whisper she'd heard from the shadows. "You cannot run from what you are," the woman continued. "The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. Our family has served the old things for generations, and now it is your turn to take up the burden." "I don't want this," Clara managed to say. "Want is irrelevant. Need is all that matters. The things we serve are growing restless, and they require fresh blood to sustain them. You will learn to feed them, to tend them, to keep them satisfied. And in return, you will be given power beyond imagining." The woman reached out with a hand that was suddenly not quite human. Fingers too long, skin too pale, nails like broken glass. "Take my hand, sister. Let me show you what we really are." Clara jerked awake, her heart pounding, her skin slick with sweat. But the relief of waking was short-lived. The book lay open beside her, and new words glowed on the page like embers. The dreams are not dreams. They are memories. They are warnings. They are invitations. Clara reached for the book, intending to slam it shut, but froze when she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. A whisper audible and clear coming from the pages themselves. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." With trembling hands, she turned to the final page. Where it had been blank before, new words now appeared, written in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing them. Chapter 2. Clara. The book snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones, and in the sudden silence, Clara could hear her own heartbeat like thunder in her ears. She was trapped now, bound by blood and fate to something she barely understood but already feared with every fibre of her being. Outside her window, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke and old violets, and somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard the sound of laughter, cold, ancient, and utterly without mercy. The book pulsed once against her hand, warm as living flesh, and Clara knew with terrible certainty that her old life was over. Whatever she was becoming, whatever her family had bound her to, there would be no escape. The blood remembered, and the blood would have its due. Chapter 3. The rumours started at Mabel's cafe, the way all rumours in Eldridge began, with a whisper over coffee that grew into a roar by closing time. Sarah Jenkins, who cleaned the church on Tuesdays, had seen Clara Whitmore walking down Main Street at 3 a.m, talking to herself like she was carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. By noon, the story had transformed. Clara was sleepwalking. Clara was having a breakdown. Clara had been seen reading from a book that glowed in the dark. The truth, as these things often went, was both simpler and more disturbing than the gossip suggested. Clara had indeed been walking the streets at night, but she hadn't been alone. The book followed her everywhere now, appearing in her hands when she least expected it, whispering secrets that made her skin crawl and her heart race with a mixture of terror and unwanted fascination. But the town didn't know that. What they knew was that Clara looked like she'd aged a decade in 3 days, that she'd stopped coming to work at the cafe, and that whenever anyone asked her about the bookstore, her eyes went wide and she changed the subject with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun a landslide. The curiosity that had initially kept people away from the Keeper of Secrets began to work in reverse. If Clara had found something so disturbing that it had changed her fundamentally, then perhaps there was something there worth finding. Frank Morrison was the first to follow Clara's lead. A Vietnam veteran who'd spent 40 years trying to forget the things he'd seen in the jungle, Frank entered the bookstore on a Thursday morning with the grim determination of a man who'd already survived one kind of hell. He emerged 2 hours later with a slim volume tucked under his arm and tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Found my brother," he told his wife that evening, clutching the book to his chest like a lifeline. "Found Billy. He's been waiting for me to come home." Billy Morrison had died in a foxhole outside Da Nang in 1967. Frank had held his hand as he bled out, had promised to tell their mother that Billy had died bravely, had carried that lie for nearly 60 years. But the book, Letters Never Sent, contained every word Billy had wanted to say before the mortar round took half his head off, written in his own careful script. Frank started visiting the bookstore every day. Mayor Patricia Vance went next, drawn by a combination of civic duty and morbid fascination. She returned home with a nosebleed and a book she refused to let anyone else see, not even her husband. When pressed, she would only say, "Some things are better left buried," but her hands shook when she said it, and she'd started locking her office door during the day. The teenager Tommy Bridger entered on a dare from his friends, swaggering through the door with all the false bravado of 17 years and a need to prove himself. He came out 15 minutes later, pale and shaking, clutching a comic book that his friends swore was moving on its own. When they asked him what he'd seen, Tommy could only stammer, "My dad. My real dad. The one who hurt me." Tommy's stepfather had raised him since he was 5. No one in town knew about the man who'd come before, about the bruises and the broken bones and the nights Tommy had spent hiding in his closet, praying that the footsteps would pass his door. But the book knew. The book remembered everything. The stories spread like a contagion through Eldridge's small population. At the diner, conversations stopped when certain people entered. In the grocery store, people averted their eyes from neighbours who'd visited the bookstore, as if whatever they'd learned might be catching. Dorothy Crane, who'd been widowed for 15 years, whispered to anyone who would listen that she'd found her husband's journal. The real one, not the sanitised version he'd left behind. Pages and pages of his thoughts about their marriage, about the affairs he'd never confessed, about the relief he'd felt when the cancer finally took him away from a life he'd grown to hate. "But he still loved me," she insisted to the other church ladies, clutching a leather-bound volume that smelled of aftershave and regret. "At the end, he still loved me." The church ladies nodded and made sympathetic noises, but they kept their distance. Dorothy had started talking to her dead husband during services, answering questions no one else could hear. Father McConnell had quietly nailed shut the chapel's donation box after Mrs. Brennan had discovered that her tithing money for the past 20 years had been going to support the priest's gambling habit. The book she'd found, Sins of the Shepherd, contained detailed records of every bet placed, every lie told, every dollar stolen from the collection plate. Arguments broke out over coffee and pie. Lines were drawn between those who saw the bookstore as a miracle and those who understood it for what it truly was. A cancer that was slowly consuming the town's carefully maintained facade of normalcy. "Truth is like surgery," old Pete Kowalski had said before he'd stopped talking altogether. "Sometimes you die from the cure." The bookstore itself seemed to grow more confident with each visitor. Where once it had been a single room lined with shelves, now a second room had appeared. No one had seen it being built, but it was there nonetheless, filled with books that seemed to write themselves as people watched. The shelves stretched higher, disappearing into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't penetrate. Some visitors reported seeing portraits inside the books, not photographs but painted miniatures that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. Jenny Caldwell, 17 and secretly pregnant, had opened a book to find a watercolor of a smiling baby with her boyfriend's eyes. The image had reached out with tiny fingers, and Jenny had felt something flutter inside her womb, as if the unborn child was trying to wave back. When people asked Madame Elara about the changes, she would only smile and say, "The store reveals what you are ready to receive." But her eyes had grown brighter, more alert, as if she was feeding on the chaos she'd unleashed. Mark Wallace first heard about the bookstore from his editor at the Eldridge Sentinel, and his initial reaction was the weary cynicism of a man who'd spent 20 years covering human misery for a living. He'd moved back to his hometown after a nervous breakdown had ended his career at the Cincinnati Post, trading crime scenes and corruption scandals for church bake sales and high school football games. At 42, Mark had the lean build of someone who'd forgotten to eat regular meals and the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much of what people were capable of doing to each other. He lived alone in a rented apartment above the hardware store, surrounded by boxes of case files and newspaper clippings that he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away. "It's probably nothing," his editor Bob Kramer had said when Mark first proposed the story. "You know how this town gets when something new happens. Remember the fuss over the coffee shop that turned out to be a front for selling pot?" But Mark had spent enough time around real mysteries to recognize the signs. The way people's voices changed when they talked about the bookstore. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The subtle shift in the town's atmosphere, like the pressure drop before a storm. He started with the usual suspects, the gossips and the busybodies who kept Eldridge's rumour mill running. Most were eager to talk, spinning tales that grew more elaborate with each telling. But when he pressed for specifics, when he asked to see the books they claimed to have found, the stories fell apart. It wasn't that people were lying exactly. It was that they were lying to themselves, editing their experiences into shapes they could live with. The truth, whatever it was too large and too terrible to be spoken aloud. "Drop it, Mark," Bob told him after the third article pitch. "We're not stirring the pot. This town barely runs as it is, and the last thing we need is you poking at something that's keeping people busy." But Mark had never been good at dropping things. It was what had made him a good reporter, and it was what had nearly destroyed him. He'd spent 3 years investigating a series of child murders in Cincinnati, digging deeper and deeper into a web of corruption that reached from the streets to the mayor's office. When he'd finally broken the story, it had taken down half the city government and cost him his marriage, his sanity, and his faith in the idea that truth was worth the price of finding it. The Keeper of Secrets stood before him like a challenge, its pristine facade a stark contrast to the decay that surrounded it. Mark pushed through the door, the brass bell remaining stubbornly silent, and found himself in a space that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of architecture and physics. "Mr. Wallace," came a voice from the shadows between the shelves. "I've been expecting you." Madame Elara emerged from the depths of the store, her black dress rustling like wings. She was older than he'd expected, but her age seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light, and her eyes held the kind of deep intelligence that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Have we met?" Mark asked, though he was certain they hadn't. He had the kind of memory that held onto faces and names, a necessity in his line of work. "Not formally, but I read your column on the 2012 factory fire. So poignant, the way you captured the grief of the families. Of course you left out the most interesting details." Mark's blood chilled. The factory fire had been one of his last major stories before the breakdown. 7 workers dead, in what had been ruled an accident. But Mark had found evidence of safety violations, of inspections that had been falsified, of a cover-up that reached deep into the city's power structure. His editor had killed the story, claiming insufficient evidence, and Mark had spent the next 6 months drinking himself into a stupor. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Of course you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, are you ready to learn the rest of the story?" Mark looked around the store, noting the way the shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, the way the books whispered to each other in languages he didn't recognize. His reporter's instincts screamed that this was all some elaborate con, but his gut, the part of him that had kept him alive through 20 years of chasing dangerous stories, told him that something genuinely supernatural was happening here. "I'm just here for a story," he said. "Background research for an article." "Are you? Then why do I sense such pain in you, such guilt? You carry your failures like stones in your pockets, Mr. Wallace. Perhaps it's time to set them down." The lights flickered as she spoke, and Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd come here expecting to debunk a small-town mystery, but he was beginning to understand that he'd walked into something far more complex and dangerous than anything he'd encountered in his career. "I should go," he said, backing toward the door. "Of course you should. But you won't. You're too much like the others, too curious, too hungry for the truth, even when the truth is more terrible than any lie." Mark fled the store, but not before he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. In the reflection of the bookstore's windows, he saw himself as a child, standing in pajamas in front of a burning building, watching the flames consume everything he'd ever known. But that was impossible. He'd grown up in Eldridge, in a house that had never burned, with parents who'd died peacefully in their sleep. He had no memories of any fire, no trauma that would explain the panic that clawed at his chest as he stumbled away from the store. The town began to unravel in small ways. Mayor Vance cancelled the fall festival, citing security concerns that no one could quite explain. 3 teachers resigned from the elementary school within the same week, and the school board couldn't find replacements. The Methodist Church split down the middle over theological differences that had never existed before, and Father McConnell announced that he was taking a leave of absence to find himself. Mark started finding black feathers everywhere he went. On his car windshield, tucked into his apartment door, scattered across his desk at the newspaper office. They were identical, each one perfect and pristine, as if they'd been plucked from the wing of some impossible bird. When he asked around, he discovered that others were finding them too. Always the people who'd visited the bookstore, always in places where they shouldn't have been. The feathers seemed to appear at moments of crisis, of revelation, as if they were marking the spots where reality had been torn and something else had leaked through. "They're omens," Dorothy Crane told him, her eyes bright with the fervour of someone who'd been granted a divine revelation. "Signs that the veil is thinning. My husband told me about them, in the book. He said they mark the places where the living and the dead touch." Mark collected the feathers in a shoebox, telling himself he was gathering evidence for his story. But late at night, when the town was quiet and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, he would take them out and arrange them in patterns that felt significant without being comprehensible. It was on his 3rd visit to the bookstore that Mark found the book waiting for him. He'd gone in with a digital recorder and a notebook full of questions, determined to crack the mystery through sheer journalistic persistence. But Madame Ilara was nowhere to be found, and the store felt different, older, more dangerous, as if it had shed its mask and revealed its true nature. The book lay open on the counter, its pages yellowed with age, the title embossed in gold letters that seemed to glow in the dim light, read, "False Fires, the Things We Bury." Mark approached it with the caution of a man who'd learned to recognize danger in all its forms. The book was thick, bound in leather, that felt warm to the touch, and when he opened it, he found himself staring at a photograph that shouldn't have existed. It showed him as a child, perhaps 6 years old, standing in pajamas on a sidewalk. Behind him, a house burned with flames that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. His face was streaked with tears and soot, and his eyes held the kind of terror that no child should ever experience. But Mark had no memory of any fire. His childhood had been normal, unremarkable, free from the kind of trauma that would leave scars. He'd grown up in the same house his parents had owned for 40 years, a house that had never burned, never been touched by tragedy. He turned the page with trembling fingers and found text written in a familiar hand, his own, though he had no memory of writing it. The fire started in the basement. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd snuck downstairs to get a drink of water. That's when I saw them, the things that weren't supposed to be there. They were tall and thin, with too many joints, and they moved like spiders. They were burning the house from the inside, starting with the photographs, moving on to the books, consuming every trace of memory and history. I tried to run, but they saw me. One of them spoke, though its mouth never moved. It said, "The boy will forget, the boy will live, but the debt remains." I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. My parents were dead. The house was gone, and I remembered nothing. Mark slammed the book shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. The photograph had to be fake, the text some kind of elaborate psychological manipulation. But as he stood in the bookstore's dim light, breathing in the scent of old paper and something else, something that smelled like smoke and terror, he could feel the memories trying to surface. The book fell open again, to a page that had been blank before. New words appeared as he watched, written in flowing script that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Mark, do you want to know what really happened that night?" He ran from the store, leaving the book behind, but he could feel its presence like a weight in his chest. The memories were coming back now, fragments and flashes that made him nauseous with their intensity. The smell of burning photographs, the sound of his mother screaming, the feeling of being watched by things that shouldn't exist. As he stumbled through the streets of Eldridge, Mark realized that he was no longer investigating a story. He was living inside one, trapped in a narrative that had been written long before he was born, playing a role he'd never auditioned for but could never escape. The bookstore had chosen him, just as it had chosen all the others. And now, like them, he would have to decide how much truth he was willing to bear. Behind him, the brass bell above the Keeper of Secrets chimed once, its sound carrying across the night air like a promise and a threat. The book was waiting for him to return, patient as a spider in its web, ready to reveal the secrets that had been buried so deep he'd forgotten they ever existed. But remembering, Mark was beginning to understand, was only the beginning. The real horror lay in what came after. In the debt that had been passed down through generations, in the price that had to be paid for survival, in the terrible weight of truth that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The feathers were everywhere now, black as midnight and soft as whispers, marking the trail that would lead him back to the fire that had shaped his life and the things that had crawled out of the flames to claim him. Chapter 4. The books multiplied like a virus through Eldridge's population, passed from hand to hand with the fevered urgency of addiction. What had started as curiosity had become compulsion, and what had been compulsion was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. By the end of the first week, nearly half the town owned a book from the Keeper of Secrets. They clutched them like talismans, carried them in purses and coat pockets, kept them on nightstands and kitchen tables. The books never seemed to run out, for every secret revealed. A new volume appeared on the store's shelves, as if the building itself was feeding on the town's pain and growing stronger with each confession extracted. Martha Reynolds had discovered her husband's 30-year affair with her sister through a slim volume titled Betrayals of Blood. The book contained every detail, every stolen kiss, every lie told across their dinner table, every moment of intimacy that had been shared while Martha worked double shifts at the hospital to pay for her sister's cancer treatments. She'd confronted them both at Sunday service, her voice echoing off the chapel walls as she read selected passages aloud. "Listen to this," she'd said, her voice shaking with rage. Chapter 7. The Christmas morning when Martha gave Linda the diamond earrings, Linda was wearing the same perfume she'd worn to the motel room the night before. The congregation had sat in stunned silence as Martha's marriage and family disintegrated in real time. Her husband had tried to deny it, but the book knew things only he could have known. The birthmark on Linda's shoulder, the way she hummed while she undressed, the pet names they'd whispered to each other in the dark. Linda had fled the church in tears. Martha's husband had followed. Martha had remained in the pew, reading aloud until Father McConnell had gently taken the book from her hands. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, 3 more families had imploded. The secrets were personal and devastating, each one calculated to cause maximum damage. Town Councilman David Pritchard learned through the sins of fathers that his mentor and father figure, Judge Williams, had been taking bribes for decades, including the one that had gotten David his first job at the courthouse. The book contained photocopies of cancelled checks, transcripts of recorded conversations, and detailed accounts of cases that had been fixed. David had stormed into the judge's chambers with the book clutched in his fist, demanding explanations that never came. Judge Williams had simply looked at the evidence, nodded once, and said, "I've been waiting for this day for 30 years. The judge had retired that afternoon. David had resigned from the town council that evening. The courthouse had been closed indefinitely due to administrative reorganization. Sarah Chen, the elementary school's most beloved teacher, had discovered through Children Lost that her best friend since childhood, Rebecca Murphy, had been the one to spread the rumor that had gotten Sarah's father fired from the factory in 1987. The book contained Rebecca's own words written in her distinctive handwriting. "I couldn't stand the way they looked at him with respect. I couldn't stand that he was everything my father wasn't." Sarah had confronted Rebecca in the grocery store, shouting accusations while other shoppers backed away in alarm. Rebecca had denied everything until Sarah had opened the book and shown her the pages written in her own hand. Pages that contained thoughts she'd never shared with anyone, secret jealousies that had festered for decades. The friendship had ended with Rebecca slapping Sarah across the face and Sarah throwing the book at her feet. The book had fallen open to a page that simply read, "Some wounds never heal. Some friendships were never real." The emotional fallout was immediate and devastating. Couples filed for divorce, business partnerships dissolved. Families stopped speaking to each other. The Methodist Church split down the middle when half the congregation discovered that the other half had been secretly meeting to discuss their theological differences behind their backs. Someone had spray-painted, "You can't confess what you deny," across the church bulletin board in dripping red letters. Father McConnell had tried to clean it off, but the paint had soaked into the wood, and the words remained visible like a scar across the building's face. Mrs. Henderson, who'd taught 3rd grade for 40 years, had a complete nervous breakdown in front of her class after reading a passage about the daughter she'd given up for adoption in 1962. The book, Choices Made in Darkness, contained the girl's full name, her adoptive parents' address, and detailed accounts of the life she'd lived. It also contained the girl's own words, written in a child's careful script. "I wonder if my real mommy thinks about me. I wonder if she's sorry she gave me away." The children had watched in horror as their teacher had sobbed over the book, rocking back and forth in her chair and whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," over and over again until the principal had arrived to escort her from the building. 2 parents had pulled their children from school that day. By the end of the week, 6 families had moved away entirely, leaving Eldridge in the middle of the night with no forwarding addresses and no explanations. Clara's isolation had become complete. She'd stopped leaving her house except for necessities, and even then, she moved through the town like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary. The book had become her constant companion, its presence both comforting and terrifying, like a tumor that had grown so large it had become essential to her survival. The dreams were getting worse. Every night she stood in the burned field where her family's farmhouse had once been. watching the woman in the white dress perform rituals that predated Christianity by centuries. The woman's face had become clearer with each dream, and Clara could see now that it was her own face, aged by years of terrible knowledge and marked by scars that spelled out words in languages that shouldn't exist. "The awakening is coming," the woman had said in the most recent dream. "The old agreements must be honored. The town must atone for its sins, and you will be the key that unlocks their punishment." Clara had tried to ask what that meant, but the woman had simply smiled and gestured to the ground around them. The ash had begun to shift and swirl, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly, and Clara had awakened with the taste of smoke in her mouth and the smell of burning flesh in her nostrils. The book was changing too. New pages appeared daily, filled with names of people who hadn't yet visited the bookstore, along with cryptic references to the secrets that awaited them. Clara had seen her own mother's name on a page titled "The Fire That Never Died," and beneath it, a single line that made her blood run cold. "Some sacrifices are made by choice, others are made by necessity." But it wasn't just the book anymore. Clara had started hearing whispers from other sources, from the walls of her house, from her reflection in mirrors, from the static between radio stations. The voices spoke in the same ancient language from her dreams, and while she couldn't understand the words, she could feel their meaning in her bones. Something was waking up inside her. Something that had been sleeping for generations, waiting for the right moment to emerge, and that moment was approaching fast. Mark's investigation had hit a wall of silence and fear. The people who'd been eager to talk about the bookstore during its first week of operation had become guarded and paranoid. They met his questions with suspicious stares and nervous deflections, as if they were afraid that speaking about their experiences would somehow make them worse. "It's not safe to talk about it," Mrs. Patterson had told him when he'd knocked on her door. "The books, they listen. They know when you're talking about them." When he'd pressed her for details, she'd simply shaken her head and closed the door. But not before he'd caught a glimpse of the book on her kitchen table. A thick volume bound in what looked like human skin, with pages that seemed to writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Sheriff Bradley had been more direct. "Drop it, Mark," he'd said, his hand resting on his gun holster with unconscious authority. "Some stories aren't meant to be told." "What's in your book, Sheriff?" Mark had asked, noting the way the man's eyes had darted to the desk drawer where something rectangular and heavy was clearly hidden. "That's not your concern." "Everything in this town is my concern. That's what journalism is." Sheriff Bradley had leaned back in his chair, studying Mark with the calculating gaze of a predator deciding whether its prey was worth the effort of hunting. "You know what journalism is, Mark? It's telling people what they want to hear in a way that makes them feel good about themselves. You want to know what's really happening here? Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." He'd opened the desk drawer and pulled out a book bound in cracked leather. The title, embossed in gold letters that seemed to pulse with their own light, read, "The Sins of Authority." "This book knows every bribe I've taken, every corner I've cut, every time I've looked the other way when I should have acted. It knows about the evidence I've lost, the cases I've buried, the people I've failed. You want to write about that, Mark? You want to tell the town that their sheriff is a corrupt piece of shit who's been covering up crimes for 20 years. Mark had stared at the book, feeling the weight of its accumulated secrets like a physical presence in the room. How does it know? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what happens when everyone's secrets are revealed? What happens when there's nothing left to hide behind? Sheriff Bradley had closed the book and returned it to the drawer. You're not investigating a story, Mark. You're documenting the end of the world. At least, the end of our world. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? The community centre hadn't seen a gathering like this since the town hall meetings about the factory closure in 2008. 10 people sat in a circle of folding chairs, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They'd come together under the pretense of a book club, but everyone knew the real reason they were there. They'd all read something that had fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their neighbours. They'd all been changed by their encounters with the Keeper of Secrets, and they all wanted answers. "We need to talk about what's happening," Martha Reynolds had said, her voice hoarse from crying. "We need to figure out how to stop this before it destroys everything." "Maybe it should be destroyed," David Pritchard had replied, his face hollow with the weight of his lost illusions. "Maybe this town has been built on so many lies that it deserves to fall." "You don't mean that," Sarah Chen had protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd been carrying Rebecca's book with her everywhere, reading and rereading the passages that detailed her friend's betrayal, picking at the wound like a scab that wouldn't heal. "Don't I? Look around, Sarah. Look at what we've become. We've been living in a fantasy, pretending that we're good people, that our secrets don't matter. But they do matter. They've always mattered. The bookstore is evil," Mrs. Henderson had said, her voice shaking. "It's designed to hurt us, to tear us apart. We need to burn it down." "With what?" Frank Morrison had asked. "You think fire will work on something like that? You think something that appeared overnight is going to be stopped by gasoline and matches?" "Then what do you suggest?" Martha had snapped. "That we just accept this? That we let it destroy our lives?" "Our lives were already destroyed," Frank had said quietly. "We just didn't know it yet." The argument had continued for an hour, voices rising and falling like the tide. Accusations flew across the circle. Who had known what? Who had kept secrets? Who had been complicit in the town's collective self-deception? The very thing that had brought them together was driving them apart. "I want to know something," Sarah had said during a lull in the fighting. "My book contained information that Rebecca never told anyone. Thoughts she never shared, secrets she never spoke aloud. How does the book know? How can it know?" The question had hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Nobody had an answer, but everyone understood the implication. If the books could reveal unspoken thoughts, then no secret was truly safe. No privacy remained. No corner of the human soul was beyond their reach. "We're being watched," Mrs. Patterson had whispered. "All the time. By something that can see into our minds, into our hearts. We're like insects under a microscope." "Then we need to find out what's watching us," Mark had said, "and we need to find out how to stop it." That's when the lights had flickered. The temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The fluorescent lights had buzzed and dimmed, casting dancing shadows across the walls. And at the back of the room, where the emergency exit led to the parking lot, a figure had appeared as if materializing from the darkness itself. Madame Elara stood with her hands folded in front of her, her black dress seeming to absorb the light around her. Her smile was gentle and terrible, like a mother watching her children play with fire. "Please," she'd said, her voice carrying easily across the room despite its soft tone. "Don't let me interrupt. I find community discussions so enlightening." The group had sat in stunned silence, afraid to move or speak. She'd entered without opening the door, appeared without footsteps, materialized like a nightmare given form. "You have questions," she'd continued, walking slowly around the circle of chairs. "About truth, about secrets, about the nature of knowledge itself. These are good questions, important questions." She'd paused behind Sarah's chair, placing a pale hand on the woman's shoulder. Sarah had flinched but hadn't pulled away, as if paralyzed by the touch. "Some truths are gifts," Elara had said, her fingers tightening slightly. "They free us from the burden of ignorance. They allow us to see the world as it truly is, not as we wish it were." She'd moved to David's chair, her hand trailing across his back like a benediction. "Others are debts. They remind us of the prices we've paid, the choices we've made, the people we've hurt along the way. They demand payment in full." Finally, she'd stopped behind Mark's chair, her breath cold against his ear. "And some are warnings. They tell us what's coming, what's already here, what's been waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge." She'd straightened, her smile widening to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too white. The question isn't how the books know your secrets. The question is, what are you going to do with the knowledge they've given you? Nobody had answered. Nobody had moved. The room had filled with the sound of 10 people trying not to breathe too loudly, afraid that any sound might draw her attention. The town must atone, she'd said, her voice taking on the cadence of an ancient prayer. The old sins must be paid for, the debts must be settled, and you, all of you, will play your parts in the reckoning that's coming. She'd walked back toward the emergency exit, her footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. At the door, she'd turned back one last time. Sleep well, she'd said. Tomorrow the real work begins. And then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of old roses and the lingering chill of a grave that had been disturbed. The violence had started that night. Harold Brennan, driven mad by the revelation that his grandfather had murdered a travelling salesman in 1968 and buried the body under the barn that now housed the church's food pantry, had doused the structure with gasoline and set it ablaze. The flames had reached into the night sky like grasping fingers, and the smell of burning wood and something else, something organic and terrible, had filled the air. The fire department had arrived too late to save the barn, but they'd managed to keep the flames from spreading to the church itself. In the ashes they'd found the bones, old and brittle, but undeniably human. The skull had been crushed, and the ribs had shown signs of being broken while the victim was still alive. Harold had been found the next morning, sitting in his kitchen with the book open in front of him, staring at pages that detailed his grandfather's crime in meticulous detail. He'd been catatonic, unresponsive to questions or stimuli, and the paramedics had taken him to the county hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The book had remained on his kitchen table, its pages fluttering in a breeze that existed only for it. But that wasn't the worst of it. The homeless man, nobody knew his name, though he'd been living rough on the edges of town for the better part of a year, had been found dead on the steps of the Keeper of Secrets. His body had been twisted into an impossible position, his limbs bent at angles that defied anatomy, his face frozen in an expression of terminal horror. Clutched in his hands had been pages torn from a book that belonged to someone else, pages that contained secrets he'd never been meant to see, knowledge that had driven him to madness and death. The pages had been covered in his own blood, as if he'd tried to claw the words from the paper with his fingernails. Sheriff Bradley had cordoned off the area, but not before half the town had seen the body. The whispers had started immediately, about curses and punishments, about the price of knowledge and the cost of truth. People had begun to avoid the bookstore, crossing the street to walk on the other side, but their books had followed them home anyway. The dead man's name had been Thomas Kellerman, grandson of the man who'd owned the building before the bookstore had appeared. The building where his grandfather had hanged himself, driven mad by whispers that came from the walls themselves. The coincidences were becoming too obvious to ignore. The patterns were emerging from the chaos, and they painted a picture of something vast and patient and utterly without mercy. Clara had discovered the blood on Thursday night. She'd been reading her book before bed, as had become her habit, when she'd noticed that the words on the page seemed different, darker, more vivid, as if they'd been written with something other than ink. When she'd touched one of the sentences, her finger had come away red. The book was bleeding. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Fresh blood seeped from the pages, pooling in the binding and dripping onto her bedsheets. The words pulsed with their own heartbeat, and when she'd tried to close the book, it had resisted her efforts, as if it had developed a will of its own. She'd opened it to the final page, and new words had appeared as she watched, written in flowing script that seemed to burn itself into the paper. The town must atone. The old sins must be paid for. The debts must be settled. You will be the key that unlocks their punishment. Clara had dropped the book, but it had landed open, its pages fluttering though no wind stirred the air in her bedroom. The blood had continued to seep from the text, forming pools that reflected images she didn't want to see. Faces of the townspeople twisted in agony, buildings consumed by flames that cast no light, shadows that moved independently of any source. She'd tried to sleep, but the book had whispered to her through the night, its voice growing stronger and more insistent with each passing hour. It spoke of sacrifices and summonings, of prices that had been deferred but never forgotten, of debts that spanned generations and demanded payment in full. When she'd finally dozed off near dawn, she'd dreamed of standing in the town square while the buildings burned around her. The townspeople had been there too, but they'd been different, changed, transformed into something that was no longer quite human. They'd looked at her with eyes that held the accumulated weight of every secret they'd ever kept, every lie they'd ever told, every sin they'd ever committed. And they'd spoken in unison, their voices harmonizing into a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. The key, the key, the key. Clara had awakened with the taste of blood in her mouth and the certainty that something irreversible was about to happen. The book lay open beside her, its pages now completely red, the text swimming in crimson like words written in a pool of gore. At the bottom of the page, in letters that seemed to burn with their own inner fire, a single line had appeared. Tomorrow, the real work begins. The same words Madame Elara had spoken at the community centre, the same promise and threat that had been echoing through the town, like a death knell. Clara had looked out her window at the quiet streets of Eldridge, at the ordinary houses filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. But she knew that the ordinariness was an illusion, a thin veneer covering something rotten and ancient and hungry. The town's secrets had been revealed, the truth had been spoken, and now the reckoning was at hand. The books had done their work, the stage was set, and Clara, whether she wanted to or not, was about to play her part in a drama that had been decades in the making. The blood on the pages spelled out her fate in letters that pulsed with malevolent life, and she knew that by tomorrow night, nothing in Eldridge would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. The whispers began on a Tuesday morning while Clara was making coffee, so faint at first that she mistook them for the radiator settling or the wind through the loose window frame in her kitchen. But when she moved away from the kitchen, the sound followed her, a susurrus of voices just below the threshold of comprehension. The book lay on her kitchen table where she'd left it the night before, its pages stained red with blood that had dried to the colour of rust. As Clara approached, the whispers grew clearer, resolving into words that made her stomach clench with recognition. You could have saved her if you'd tried harder. The accident wasn't an accident, and you know it. You wanted her gone, didn't you, Clara? You wanted her to disappear. Clara's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. The whispers were coming from the book, not from pages being turned or air moving through the binding, but from the words themselves, as if each letter had developed its own vocal cords. She backed away from the table, but the voices followed her, growing louder and more insistent. They spoke her thoughts before she could think them, articulated fears she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself they didn't exist. Tell us about Emma, Clara. Tell us about the ladder. No, Clara whispered, pressing her hands against her ears, but the whispers came from inside her skull now, reverberating through her bones. Tell us how you called her name, how you made her look up just as you pushed. Tell us how satisfying it felt to hear her scream. Clara ran to her bedroom and slammed the door, but the book was already there, lying open on her pillow like a lover waiting for her return. The pages fluttered without any breeze to stir them, and the words rearranged themselves as she watched, forming new sentences that pulsed with malevolent life. The book had become empathic, responding to her emotional state with unsettling immediacy. When Clara cried, which happened more frequently now, sudden floods of tears that came without warning, the ink on the pages would warp and bleed, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. When anger flashed through her, rare but intense, the book would tremble against whatever surface it rested on, its covers opening and closing like a mouth trying to speak. But it was more than responsive. It was feeding. Clara could feel it drawing something from her with each passing hour, some essential part of herself that she couldn't name but knew was vital to her humanity. She was becoming lighter, more translucent, as if the book was gradually consuming her substance and replacing it with something else. The words on the pages had begun to move when she stared at them too long, letters sliding across the paper like living things. Sometimes they formed images. Her mother's face twisted with terror, a memory of a car crash from her teenage years where she'd walked away uninjured while the other driver had been taken away in an ambulance, a hand reaching out from flames that cast no light. These visions appeared behind the text, like phantoms lurking in the spaces between words. They were clearer than memories, more vivid than dreams, and they filled her with a mixture of recognition and revulsion that made her physically ill. The book was showing her the truth about herself, and the truth was uglier than she'd ever imagined. Emma Castillo had been her best friend in elementary school. Bright, kind, always ready with a smile and a shared secret. They'd been inseparable until that day in 3rd grade when they'd been playing in Emma's backyard, daring each other to climb higher and higher on the wooden ladder that led to her treehouse. Clara had gone first, reaching the top rung and looking down at Emma with a mixture of pride and superiority. But when Emma had started to climb, moving with the natural grace that had always made Clara feel clumsy and inadequate, something dark and cold had stirred in Clara's chest. "Emma!" she'd called out, and when her friend had looked up with trusting eyes, Clara had placed her foot against the top of the ladder and pushed. The fall had lasted only seconds, but Clara remembered every detail, the look of surprise and betrayal on Emma's face, the sound of bone breaking against concrete, the way Emma's scream had cut off abruptly when her head hit the patio stones. Emma had survived, but her leg had been shattered. She'd spent months in a cast, missed most of the school year, and her family had moved away the following summer. They'd kept in touch for a while, but the friendship had never recovered from the weight of what had happened. Clara had told everyone it was an accident, had told the adults that Emma had slipped, that the ladder had been unstable, that she'd tried to grab her friend's hand but had been too far away. She'd told the story so many times and with such conviction that she'd eventually begun to believe it herself. But the book knew better. The page was filled with Emma's words now, written in the careful script of an 8-year-old. "Clara pushed me. I saw her face when I was falling. She wasn't trying to help. She was happy. She wanted me to get hurt because I was better at climbing than her. I told my mommy, but she said I was confused from hitting my head. But I remember everything." Clara slammed the book shut, but it fell open again immediately, the pages rustling like dry leaves. New words appeared, written in her own adult handwriting. "You called it an accident. She called it a betrayal. The truth is somewhere in between, isn't it, Clara? The truth is that you wanted her gone, and you found a way to make it happen." Sleep became impossible. Every time Clara closed her eyes, she could see Emma falling, could hear the sound of breaking bones, could feel the satisfaction that had bloomed in her chest like a poisonous flower. The book whispered to her through the night, its voice growing stronger and more insistent with each passing hour. She stopped looking in mirrors after she caught sight of herself holding the book even when her hands were empty. The reflection showed her standing with the volume pressed against her chest like a shield, her eyes dark and glittering with an intelligence that didn't feel entirely her own. The mirrors in her house began to show other things too, glimpses of Eldridge burning, of townspeople screaming as their own books turned against them, of shadows that moved without casting sources. In every reflection, Clara stood at the center of the chaos, calm and untouched while destruction swirled around her. Her cat, Whiskers, had stopped coming near her entirely. The animal would sit in doorways and stare at her with eyes full of animal wisdom and terror, as if it could see something about her that she couldn't yet perceive. When she tried to approach, it would flee to hiding places it had never used before, under beds, behind furniture, anywhere that felt safe from whatever she was becoming. Madame Elara arrived at dusk on Thursday, materializing at Clara's front door without footsteps or warning. She carried a silver tea service that looked ancient and valuable, and her smile was as gentle and terrible as a mother's love. "May I come in, dear?" she asked, though she was already stepping across the threshold. "I thought you might enjoy some company." Clara found herself nodding, though she hadn't consciously decided to invite the woman inside. Elara moved through the house with the confidence of someone who'd been there many times before, setting up the tea service on Clara's kitchen table with practiced efficiency. "You're struggling," Elara said, pouring steaming liquid into delicate porcelain cups. The tea was dark as blood and smelled of roses and something else, something organic and slightly sweet. "The truth is a heavy burden, especially when it concerns ourselves." "I don't know what's happening to me," Clara whispered, accepting the cup with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. "You're awakening, child, coming into your true nature. It's always difficult at first, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. The process is painful, but the result is beautiful." Elara settled into the chair across from Clara, her dark eyes reflecting the light in ways that seemed to bend physics. "Tell me about Emma." Clara choked on her tea. "How do you—" "The book tells me many things, but I want to hear it from you. The truth isn't a punishment, Clara. It's a mirror, and most people break it rather than look too long." So Clara told her. About the ladder, about the fall, about the lie she'd lived with for so many years. As she spoke, the weight on her chest seemed to lighten, as if sharing the burden had somehow made it bearable. Elara listened without judgment, nodding occasionally and sipping her tea. When Clara finished, the older woman reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. "Guilt is a choice," she said softly. "You can carry it like a stone around your neck, or you can set it down and walk away. The book isn't showing you these things to torment you, Clara. It's showing them to you so you can finally be free." Free of what? Of pretense, of the exhausting effort of being someone you're not. You've spent your entire life trying to be good, haven't you? Trying to make up for what you did to Emma. But what if goodness is just another lie? What if your true nature is something darker, more honest? Clara stared into her teacup, watching the dark liquid swirl in patterns that looked almost like symbols. "I don't want to be dark. Want is irrelevant, dear. You are what you are. The question is whether you'll embrace it or spend the rest of your life fighting it." Elara finished her tea and began packing up the service. The book cannot lie, but it will protect those who embrace it, who accept the truth of what they are. Think about that, Clara. Think about what you really want. After she left, Clara sat in her kitchen until well past midnight, staring at the book and listening to its whispers. They were gentler now, more seductive, speaking of power and freedom and the intoxicating relief of finally being honest about who she really was. The changes accelerated after Elara's visit. Clara found that she could sense the emotions of others simply by being near their books. When she walked past houses where the volumes from the Keeper of Secrets were hidden, she could feel the turmoil and anguish of their owners like a physical weight in the air. Mrs. Reynolds's grief was sharp and bitter, cutting through Clara's consciousness like broken glass. David Pritchard's shame was heavy and suffocating, pressing down on her lungs until she could barely breathe. Sarah Chen's rage was hot and acidic, burning the back of her throat with its intensity. But underneath all of it was something else, something that tasted like copper and smelled like ozone. Fear. Not just fear of their revealed secrets, but fear of something larger and more terrible that was approaching like a storm front. Clara's reflection had begun to change as well. Her eyes were darker now, pupils dilated as if she were constantly in low light. Her skin had taken on a pallor that makeup couldn't hide, and when she spoke, sometimes other voices seemed to echo her words, whispers that came from no identifiable source. Even her movements felt different, more fluid and purposeful, as if she was learning to inhabit her body in a new way. She caught herself walking differently, holding her head at angles that felt ancient and ceremonial. The book had become a part of her now, as essential as her heartbeat. When she tried to leave it behind, it would appear wherever she went, on passenger seats, in bathroom mirrors, tucked into her purse, though she had no memory of putting it there. Its whispers followed her everywhere, a constant murmur just below conscious hearing that coloured every thought and emotion. On Saturday night, the book showed her something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The pages opened to reveal not words but moving images, like a film projected onto paper. She saw Eldridge as it would be, buildings consumed by flames that cast no shadows, townspeople running through streets that led nowhere, books flying open on their own and releasing things that should never have been bound. And at the centre of it all stood Clara herself, calm and untouched by the chaos swirling around her. The book in the vision was open in her hands, and light poured from its pages. Not the warm yellow light of electricity or candles, but something cold and ancient that made the shadows dance. The Clara in the vision looked directly at her through the page, smiled with lips that were too red and teeth that were too sharp, and mouthed words that she felt rather than heard. Welcome home. The vision faded, leaving only blank pages that gradually filled with new text. The awakening is nearly complete. The town has been prepared. The debts are ready to be collected. Soon you will understand your true purpose. Clara touched the words, and they came away on her fingertip like wet ink, though they remained clearly visible on the page. The ink was warm and tasted of copper when she unconsciously licked her finger clean. She had to know, had to understand what was happening to her, what she was becoming, what role she was meant to play in whatever was coming to Eldridge. So on Sunday evening, when the shadows grew long and the air itself seemed to whisper with anticipation, Clara walked to the Keeper of Secrets and knocked on its door. Madame Ilara answered immediately as if she'd been waiting by the entrance. "I need to ask you something," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course, dear. Come in." The interior of the bookstore had changed again. The shelves now stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness that the overhead lights couldn't penetrate. Books floated in the air, their pages turning on their own, and whispers filled the space like the murmur of a distant congregation. "Why me?" Clara asked. "Out of everyone in this town, why was I chosen?" Ilara moved closer, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. When she reached Clara, she lifted one pale hand and touched the younger woman's cheek with infinite gentleness. "Because the hollow opens for its chosen," she whispered, her breath cold against Clara's ear. "And you, my dear, are nearly ready to hear it. What's the hollow?" But Ilara only smiled and stepped back, melting into the shadows between the shelves. "Tomorrow night, all will be revealed. Rest now, Clara. You'll need your strength for what's coming." Clara walked home through streets that seemed different somehow, older, more primal, as if the town's careful facade of modernity was finally beginning to slip. The streetlights flickered as she passed beneath them, and she could swear she heard footsteps following her, though every time she turned around, the sidewalk was empty. That night, the whispers came not from her book, but from the air itself. They spoke in languages that predated human speech, in harmonics that resonated in her bones, in frequencies that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. But for the first time since the whispers had begun, Clara wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt a deep sense of anticipation, of coming home to a place she'd never known she belonged. The voices were welcoming her, calling her name in tones of ancient reverence. She was ready to answer. The book lay open beside her pillow, its pages now completely crimson, the text swimming in blood like words written in a pool of life itself. At the bottom of the final page, in letters that burned with their own inner fire, new words appeared. The hollow calls to its daughter, "Will you answer?" Clara pressed her palm against the page, feeling the warm wetness of blood soaking into her skin. When she lifted her hand, her palm print remained on the paper, dark as a signature and twice as binding. "Yes," she whispered into the darkness, "I will answer." Outside her window the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of laughter, ancient, knowing, and utterly without mercy. The transformation was nearly complete. Tomorrow night, Clara would learn exactly what she'd agreed to become, and Eldridge would finally pay the price for its carefully buried sins. Chapter 6. Eldridge came apart like a body in advanced decay, the careful facade of civility rotting away to reveal the putrid truth beneath. By Monday morning the streets were littered with broken glass and torn pages, the detritus of a community that had finally stopped pretending to be something it wasn't. The violence had started small, whispered accusations in grocery store aisles, cold shoulders in church pews, meaningful glances across restaurant tables. But secrets once exposed have a momentum all their own, and the revelations contained in the books from the Keeper of Secrets had created a cascade of destruction that no one could control. Martha Reynolds had cornered her sister Linda outside the post office, screaming about 30 years of betrayal while waving a blood-stained book in the air. The fight had escalated quickly, culminating with Martha smashing Linda's car windshield with a tire iron while shouting passages about stolen kisses and broken promises. "Listen to this!" Martha had shrieked, her voice carrying across the town square. Chapter 12. The morning after Gerald's funeral, Linda came to comfort me. But she'd been in his bed the night before, wearing the perfume I bought her for Christmas. Linda had fled in tears, but not before the gathered crowd had heard every humiliating detail. By evening the story had spread through Eldridge like wildfire, and the town had chosen sides with the vicious enthusiasm of people who'd been starved for entertainment. Father McConnell hadn't fared much better. His book, The Shepherd's Sins, had been nailed to the church door like a medieval declaration of war, its pages fluttering in the wind for all to see. The accusations it contained were damning: embezzlement, gambling, and a 15-year affair with the mayor's mother that had produced a child everyone thought had died in infancy. The congregation had pelted him with stones as he tried to enter the church for morning mass, their faces twisted with the righteous fury of people who'd discovered their shepherd was a wolf. One rock had opened a gash above his left eye, and the blood had streamed down his face like stigmata as he'd stumbled away from his own sanctuary. The books had developed a malevolent intelligence, appearing where they could do the most damage. Personal secrets were found taped to storefront windows, tucked under car windshield wipers, slipped through mail slots like poison pen letters from hell. The more people tried to hide their revelations, the more public they became. David Pritchard had attempted to burn his book in his backyard fireplace, watching with grim satisfaction as the flames consumed the evidence of his corruption. But when he'd returned to his bedroom that night, the book had been waiting on his pillow, completely intact and open to the page he feared most. David Pritchard accepted his first bribe at age 26. The judge who offered it said, "Everyone has a price. The only question is whether you're honest enough to name yours." The attempts at destruction had become increasingly desperate. People tried drowning the books, running them through paper shredders, even burying them in their backyards. But the volumes always returned, often appearing in more prominent locations than before: on kitchen tables during family dinners, in briefcases during important meetings, on dashboards during traffic stops. One woman had thrown her book into the river, only to find it floating in her bathtub the next morning, its pages somehow dry despite having spent 12 hours underwater. The ink hadn't even smudged. The violence escalated with each passing day. Mrs. Anderson, the third-grade teacher who taught half the town's children, was found hanging in the school's attic, her book open beside her body to a page that contained her suicide note, written in her own handwriting, though she'd never put pen to paper. "I can't live with what I've done," the note read. "The children I failed, the reports I falsified, the parents I lied to. Mrs. Peterson was right to say I should never have been trusted with children. I'm not fit to live." The discovery had sent shockwaves through the community. Mrs. Anderson had been beloved, a fixture of the school system for 30 years. But her book, Failures of Trust, had revealed a pattern of negligence and cover-ups that painted her as a monster hiding behind a grandmother's smile. Harold Brennan, driven to madness by the revelation of his grandfather's murder, had killed his wife with a kitchen knife while she slept. He'd been found the next morning sitting beside her body, reading aloud from his book while her blood pooled around his feet. "It says I had to make it right," he'd told the sheriff with the calm rationality of the completely insane. "The book knows what needs to be done. I was just following instructions." Harold had been taken to the county psychiatric facility, but not before word had spread that his book contained detailed instructions for balancing the scales and paying the debts of blood. Other book owners had begun to study their volumes with new intensity, looking for similar guidance. Mayor Vance had declared a town curfew for the first time since 1949, when a rabid dog had terrorized the streets. But the books didn't respect curfews, and the violence continued behind closed doors. Families turning on each other, neighbors settling decades-old scores, friends discovering that their deepest confidences had been nothing but lies. The most disturbing development was Madame Elara's disappearance. The Keeper of Secrets remained open, its door swinging freely in the breeze, but the mysterious proprietor was nowhere to be found. The brass bell above the entrance had fallen silent, and the interior of the store had taken on the quality of a mausoleum, cold, still, and heavy, with the weight of accumulated secrets. People continued to enter, drawn by compulsions they couldn't resist, but they emerged changed in ways that went beyond the revelation of personal truths. They moved differently, spoke in cadences that sounded ancient and formal, and their eyes held depths that hadn't been there before. Some claimed to see Elara everywhere, watching from windows that shouldn't exist, standing in reflections that showed empty rooms, moving through the shadows between buildings like smoke given form. Others insisted she'd never existed at all, that the books had always been there, waiting for someone desperate enough to open them. But those who looked closely at the store's windows could sometimes catch glimpses of her, standing behind the glass with that same gentle, terrible smile. She never moved, never acknowledged their presence, but her eyes followed them as they passed, tracking their movements with the patience of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere to run. Clara Whitmore had become the eye of the hurricane, moving through the chaos with an otherworldly calm that made people cross the street to avoid her. The transformation that had begun with the whispers was now complete, and she bore little resemblance to the quiet cafe worker who'd first entered the bookstore. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if she was slowly becoming something other than human. Her eyes were completely black now, pupils dilated beyond any natural state, and when she spoke, other voices seemed to echo her words, whispers that came from the air around her rather than her throat. She carried her book everywhere, cradled against her chest like a sacred text. The volume had grown thicker, its pages multiplying as the town's secrets accumulated, and witnesses claimed they could see words writing themselves across the blood-stained paper. Children ran from her approach, their animal instincts recognizing danger even when their minds couldn't process what they were seeing. Dogs howled when she passed, and cats disappeared into hiding places that their owners couldn't find. But it wasn't fear that Clara inspired. It was reverence. Some of the book owners had begun to follow her at a distance, walking in her wake like disciples following a dark messiah. They didn't speak to her, didn't approach her, but they watched with the desperate intensity of drowning people who'd spotted a lifeline. Clara seemed aware of their attention but indifferent to it. She moved through Eldridge with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what she was meant to do when she arrived. Mark Wallace had spent 3 sleepless days in the newspaper's archives, digging through records that went back to the town's founding. What he'd discovered had shaken him to his core, confirming suspicions he'd hoped were nothing more than paranoid speculation. The pattern was there, hidden in the careful language of old newspaper reports and the euphemistic prose of official records. Every 37 years, Eldridge had experienced a period of what the documents called social unrest, mass hysteria, unexplained suicides, and the appearance of a mysterious business that no one could quite remember afterward. In 1897, it had been a curiosity shop run by a woman described as foreign and unsettling. The local paper had reported a string of suicides and violent crimes, along with strange lights in the sky and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The shop had burned down during what was officially called a gas leak explosion, but witness accounts described flames that burned cold and smoke that formed words in languages no one recognized. In 1933, it had been a lending library operated by a woman of indeterminate age and suspicious character. The town had nearly torn itself apart during the depths of the Depression, neighbors turning on neighbors, families destroying themselves over revelations that the authorities claimed were mass delusions brought on by economic hardship. The descriptions of the proprietors were eerily consistent across the decades. Always a woman, always ageless, always possessing knowledge that she shouldn't have. The businesses were always destroyed in the end, but the damage they caused lingered for years afterward. Most disturbing of all was a photograph Mark had found in a box of uncatalogued materials from 1897. It showed the curiosity shop's storefront in perfect detail. The same architectural style, the same window displays, even the same brass bell hanging above the door. And standing in front of the shop, posed for the camera with that familiar gentle smile, was Madame Elara. She hadn't aged a day in over a century. The breakthrough had come when Mark had discovered the missing journal of Ezra Whitmore, one of Eldridge's founding fathers and Clara's distant ancestor. The leather-bound volume had been misfiled among church records, its existence forgotten by everyone except the rats that had been slowly consuming its pages. Ezra's final entries painted a picture of desperate men making bargains they didn't understand with forces they couldn't control. The town had been dying, its population decimated by disease and crop failures that seemed to target Eldridge specifically. The survivors had been preparing to abandon the settlement when salvation had arrived in the form of a woman who called herself the Keeper. She came to us in our darkest hour. Ezra had written in his careful script, promised us prosperity and peace, an end to our sufferings. All she asked in return was that we forget the old troubles, the old sorrows, the old truths that had brought us to ruin. We agreed readily enough. What choice did we have? The binding was sealed with blood and ink, words written in the old tongue that none of us could read. She said the town would thrive, that our children would prosper, that the land would provide. But there would be a price. Every generation, the debts would come due. The secrets we buried would surface. The truth we'd hidden would demand acknowledgement. She said she would return when the time came, when the accumulated weight of our lies grew too heavy for the binding to hold. She would come as friend and judge, offering redemption to those who embraced their true nature and destruction to those who clung to their illusions. The journal's final entry was dated 3 days before Ezra's death. The signs are already beginning. My grandson speaks in his sleep, words in the old tongue that make the windows rattle. The animals avoid our house, and the well water tastes of copper and regret. She is coming soon, I think. The Keeper is coming to collect what we owe. Mark had stared at the yellowed pages until his eyes burned, finally understanding the scope of what was happening to Eldridge. This wasn't random supernatural chaos. It was the fulfillment of a contract signed in desperation over 2 centuries ago. The town had traded its soul for prosperity, and now the bill had come due. The confrontation had been inevitable. Monday evening found half the town gathered at Mabel's cafe, the only neutral ground left in a community that had divided itself along lines of guilt and blame. The atmosphere was electric with tension, accusations flying like sparks from a bonfire. "This is all connected," Sarah Chen had shouted, her face flushed with rage and exhaustion. "The books, the secrets, the way people are acting. Someone planned this." "It's her," Martha Reynolds had said, pointing a trembling finger at Clara, who sat alone at a corner table with her book open in front of her. "Ever since she went into that place, everything's gone to hell. She's the reason this is happening." Clara had looked up from her reading with eyes that reflected the cafe's fluorescent lights like black mirrors. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the windows rattle. "The books don't lie," she'd said simply. "Only people do." "What's that supposed to mean?" David Pritchard had demanded, though he'd kept his distance from her table. "It means you're angry at the wrong thing. You're not angry about your secrets being revealed. You're angry that you had secrets to begin with. You're not afraid of the books. You're afraid of yourselves." The silence that followed had been deafening. Clara had returned to her reading, turning pages that seemed to turn themselves, while the gathered townspeople had stared at her with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "You knew," Margaret Flores had whispered. "You knew this would happen." Clara had smiled, and for a moment her face had resembled Madame Ilara's, ancient, knowing, and utterly without mercy. "I know what's coming next," she'd said, "and so do you, if you're honest with yourselves. The town made a choice a long time ago. Now it's time to live with the consequences." The gathering had broken up after that, people drifting away in small groups, whispering among themselves about what Clara had said and what it might mean. But they'd all felt it, the sense that events were moving toward some inevitable conclusion, that the chaos of the past week had been nothing more than a prelude to something far worse. The attempt to destroy the bookstore had been organized by desperation rather than hope. Tuesday night had found 30 of Eldridge's residents gathered in the town square, armed with gasoline, axes, and the kind of grim determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. Sheriff Bradley had tried to stop them, but his authority had evaporated along with the town's respect for law and order. The crowd had pushed past him with the single-minded purpose of a lynch mob, marching toward the Keeper of Secrets like soldiers advancing on an enemy stronghold. The building had stood before them in the darkness, its windows glowing with a light that came from no visible source. The door had hung open, swaying in a breeze that touched nothing else, and the brass bell had chimed once as they had approached, a sound like funeral bells in the distance. "Burn it down!" someone had shouted, and the crowd had surged forward, dousing the storefront with gasoline and striking matches with hands that shook with fear and rage. But the flames had behaved in ways that violated every law of physics. Instead of consuming the building, the fire had been consumed by it, drawn into the wood and brick like water into thirsty soil. The walls had glowed with absorbed light, and the windows had blazed like eyes in the darkness. The smoke that rose from the building had formed words in the sky, letters 20 feet tall that spelled out messages in flowing script. What is written cannot be undone. The debts of blood must be paid. The hollow calls to its children. Several members of the mob had collapsed as their own books had spontaneously combusted in their hands, the flames racing up their arms like living things. Their screams had echoed across the town square as they'd beat at fires that couldn't be extinguished, their skin blistering and charring while the books themselves remained untouched. The crowd had fled in terror, leaving behind only the smell of burned flesh and the sound of laughter that seemed to come from the building itself. The keeper of secrets had stood unharmed, its door swinging gently in the breeze, waiting for the next visitor to cross its threshold. Mark's phone had rung at 3 in the morning, jarring him from dreams filled with burning buildings and ancient contracts written in blood. The voice on the other end was old and frail, barely more than a whisper. "I remember," the woman had said without preamble. "I remember the last time this happened." "Who is this?" "Agnes Kellerman. I'm 93 years old, and I was here in 1987 when she came before. My grandfather told me stories about 1933, and his grandfather told him about 1897. It's always the same pattern." Mark had grabbed a notebook, his journalist's instincts overriding his exhaustion. What pattern? What happens? First, the shop appears, then the books, then the town tears itself apart. But that's not the end, that's just the beginning. The real horror starts when the hollow opens. What's the hollow? Agnes had been quiet for so long that Mark had thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. It's where she keeps them, all the people who've accepted her bargain over the years. They don't die, Mr. Wallace. They go into the hollow and wait. Wait for the next time the debts come due, the next time the town needs to be cleansed. Where is it? Edge of town, past the old mining road. There's a depression in the woods where nothing grows, where the ground stays cold even in summer. My grandfather used to say it was where the first families made their deal with her, where Ezra Whitmore signed his name in blood and promised his descendants souls. The line had gone dead, leaving Mark staring at his phone in the darkness. Outside his window, he could see the glow from the bookstore's windows, pulsing like a heartbeat in the night. Clara stood at the edge of the hollow as dawn broke over Eldridge, her book open in her hands and her dark eyes reflecting the pale morning light. The depression stretched before her like a wound in the earth, 50 feet across and perfectly circular, its sides sloping down to a center that was lost in shadows no sunlight could penetrate. Nothing grew in the hollow. The soil was black and rich, but no seed would take root there, no grass would grow. Animals avoided the area entirely, and even insects seemed to skirt around its edges. The air above the depression shimmered with heat distortion despite the cool morning temperature, and strange sounds echoed from its depths, whispers, laughter, and something that might have been weeping. Clara could feel them down there. All the people who'd accepted Madame Ilara's bargain over the years, who'd embraced their true nature and found their place in the grand design. They were waiting, patient as stones, ready to emerge when the time was right. The wind howled through the trees around the hollow, carrying with it the scent of old roses and the sound of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Clara lifted her face to the breeze and smiled, feeling the last vestiges of her humanity fall away like a shed skin. "It's beginning again," she whispered, and her words echoed from the depths of the hollow, like a promise being made and kept. Behind her, Eldridge continued its slow spiral into chaos, the bookstore glowing like a beacon in the growing light. Soon, very soon, the real work would begin. The debts would be paid, the sins would be punished, and the town would learn the true cost of the bargain their ancestors had made. Clara opened her book to the final page, where new words were writing themselves in flowing script. The hollow opens at midnight. The chosen will answer. The reckoning will be complete. She pressed her palm against the wet ink, feeling it soak into her skin like a brand. When she lifted her hand, her fingerprints remained on the page, dark as old blood and twice as binding. The transformation was complete. The debt was ready to be collected, and Clara Whitmore, the last daughter of Ezra's line, was finally ready to come home. Chapter 7. Clara stood at the edge of the hollow as the sun climbed higher, her book open in her hands and her consciousness drifting between present and past, like smoke between worlds. The depression in the earth pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and with each pulse, the veil between then and now grew thinner. The first vision struck without warning. Eldridge, November 1897. The town had been dying. Not the slow, graceful decline of places that had simply outlived their purpose, but the violent, desperate death of a creature caught in a trap of its own making. The crops had failed for 3 consecutive years, withering in fields that had once been the pride of the county. Livestock had sickened and died from diseases that no veterinarian could identify. The railroad that had promised prosperity had rerouted around them, leaving Eldridge isolated and forgotten. But it was the children who had broken the adults' resolve. They had begun dying in their sleep, simply failing to wake one morning with no sign of illness or injury. 12 children in 2 months, their small bodies found peaceful and cold in beds that had become coffins. The surviving townspeople, barely 200 souls clinging to life in a place that seemed actively hostile to their existence, had gathered in the meeting hall on a November night that smelled of snow and desperation. Nathaniel Darren, the town's founder and Clara's distant ancestor, had stood before them, with the weight of leadership crushing his shoulders. "We've tried everything," he had said, his voice hoarse from weeks of prayer and pleading. "The doctors, the priests, the federal agents, none of them have answers. If we don't find a solution soon, there won't be a town left to save." The murmurs that had rippled through the crowd had been thick with fear and growing madness. Families who had been friends for generations had begun to eye each other with suspicion. Some whispered that the deaths were murders, that someone among them was picking off the children one by one. Others claimed it was divine judgment, punishment for sins they couldn't name. It was Jeremiah Whitmore, Clara's great-great-grandfather, who had first spoken the words that would damn them all. "There are older ways," he had said, rising from his seat in the back of the room. "Ways that predate the church, ways that were old when the first Europeans set foot on this continent. My grandmother was Cherokee before she married into our family. She told me stories about places like this, places where the land itself has turned sour, where the spirits of the earth have been corrupted by human cruelty." "What are you suggesting?" Darren had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "We make a pact. We offer something in exchange for salvation. The old powers don't work for free, but they do work." The debate that had followed had lasted until dawn, voices rising and falling like a tide of desperation. Some had called Jeremiah's suggestion blasphemy, others had dismissed it as superstition. But as the night had worn on and the temperature had dropped, the practical reality had become impossible to ignore. They were going to die anyway. At least this way they had a chance. The vote had been taken in secret, hands raised in the darkness so that no one could see who had chosen salvation over damnation. The motion had passed by a margin of 3 votes. Clara gasped, the vision fading as she found herself back in the present, standing at the edge of the hollow with tears streaming down her face. The book in her hands was warm to the touch, its pages rustling in a breeze that touched nothing else. But the visions weren't finished with her. The hollow December 1897. The ritual had taken place on the winter solstice, when the barrier between worlds was thinnest and the old powers could hear the prayers of desperate mortals. 13 men had gathered in the depression that would become known as the Hollow, the town's leaders, its most respected citizens, the ones who had the most to lose if Eldridge died. They had brought offerings, gold coins, family heirlooms, the blood of sacrificial animals. But when the entity they had summoned had finally manifested, it had made clear that such trinkets were insufficient payment for the service they requested. "You ask for more than you understand," the voice had whispered from the darkness at the center of the depression. It had spoken without a throat, its words forming in the air like condensation on cold glass. "You ask for forgiveness without repentance, for salvation without sacrifice. The price for such arrogance is higher than you imagine." "Name it," Nathaniel Darren had said, his voice steady despite the terror that had gripped his heart. Whatever you want, we'll pay it. Truth, the entity had replied. You will give me your truth, all of it, every secret, every shame, every sin that has ever stained your souls. I will keep them safe, buried deep where they cannot harm you. But in return you will forget. You will forget the darkness that lives in your hearts, the cruelty that shaped your actions, the lies that built your lives. You will live in ignorance of your own nature, clean and pure and false. And if we refuse, then you will die as you have lived, in full knowledge of what you truly are. The men had exchanged glances in the darkness, each seeing his own desperation reflected in the other's eyes. They had come too far to turn back now. There will be a price, the entity had continued. Every generation, the debt will come due. The truth you have buried will surface, demanding acknowledgement. Some will accept it and find peace. Others will fight it and find destruction. But the choice will always be yours. Jeremiah Whitmore had been the first to step forward, kneeling in the frozen soil and placing his hands on the ground. I accept. One by one, the others had followed, their knees hitting the earth with the finality of coffin nails. They had spoken their names, their sins, their deepest shames into the darkness, feeling the weight of their guilt lifted from their shoulders as the entity consumed it all. The ritual had ended with the signing of a contract written in blood and ink, the words appearing on parchment that had seemed to form from the air itself. Each man had pricked his finger and pressed it to the page, sealing the bargain with their life essence. When dawn had broken, they had returned to town changed. The children stopped dying, the crops began to grow again, and the railroad announced its plans to extend service to Eldridge after all. But the men who had made the pact found that they could no longer remember exactly what they had agreed to, or why they sometimes woke screaming from dreams filled with darkness and whispers. The Hollow had been born that night, and with it, the cycle that would define Eldridge for generations to come. Spring 1898. The bookstore had appeared without fanfare or explanation, standing on Main Street one morning as if it had always been there. The townspeople accepted its presence with the same unquestioning compliance that had allowed them to forget their own sins, walking past it daily without wondering where it had come from or who had built it. The keeper of secrets read the sign above the door, painted in letters that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view. The windows were filled with books that couldn't be purchased, only received, and each volume reflected the reader's hidden nature with uncomfortable accuracy. Those who entered emerged, changed. Some burned their books in fits of rage or terror, only to find them waiting on their nightstands the next morning. Others became obsessed with their revelations, reading and rereading the same passages until the words were burned into their minds. A few simply disappeared, their houses standing empty, their belongings left behind as if they had simply evaporated. The first suicide had been Thomas Kellerman, a respected merchant who had hanged himself from the oak tree in the town square after his book had revealed his role in the deaths of 3 travelling salesmen. His note had been brief: "The truth is too heavy to carry. I choose to set it down." Others had followed, families destroying themselves over revelations that their neighbours claimed were impossible, marriages dissolving over secrets that had been buried for decades. The town's population had dropped by nearly half before the crisis had finally ended, leaving behind a community that was smaller, quieter, and somehow cleaner than it had been before. But the survivors had adapted, as survivors always do. They had learned to live with the bookstore's presence, to accept its periodic harvests of truth and guilt. They had developed an unspoken understanding that some things were better left buried, that the price of peace was a willingness to forget. 1901, she had appeared on a Tuesday morning in spring, walking down Main Street as if she had always belonged there, tall and elegant, dressed in grey silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She moved with the timeless grace of someone who had learned patience from centuries of practice. No one questioned her presence. No one asked where she had come from or why she had chosen Eldridge. She simply was, as natural and inevitable as the sunrise, and the townspeople accepted her with the same unthinking compliance that had allowed them to forget their own darkness. She had taken up residence in the rooms above the bookstore, though no one could remember seeing her move furniture or belongings. She seemed to exist without the normal requirements of human life: food, sleep, companionship. She was simply there, always there, watching over the books and the secrets they contained. The children had been the first to notice her unusual nature. They had whispered about the lady who never aged, who spoke to shadows, who could look into their hearts and see all the cruel thoughts they tried to hide. But children's stories were easily dismissed, and the adults had learned to ignore anything that might disturb their carefully constructed peace. She had called herself Madame Elara, though some of the older residents claimed she had used different names in different eras. She had been patient and kind, offering tea and sympathy to those who sought her out, providing comfort to those who were struggling with the weight of their revealed truths. But she had also been relentless. When the time came for the debts to be paid, she had stood by and watched as the town tore itself apart, offering neither help nor hindrance. She had been a witness to the cycles of revelation and forgetting, a constant presence in a world that preferred to pretend she didn't exist. By 1920, the children who had whispered about her had become adults who claimed they had been mistaken. By 1933, she was blamed for the disappearances that had marked the Second Great Reckoning. By 1966, she was dismissed as a local legend, a story told to frighten children who stayed out too late. But she had remained, patient as stone, waiting for the next cycle to begin. The pattern emerges. Clara watched the decades blur together in her mind's eye, seeing the same events play out again and again with minor variations. The bookstore would appear, the secrets would be revealed, the town would convulse in an orgy of truth and violence. Then came the forgetting, deliberate, systematic, necessary for survival. Public records were burned, stories twisted into myths, survivors relocated or silenced. The town's official history became a sanitized version of reality, scrubbed clean of anything that might disturb the peace or raise uncomfortable questions. But Eldridge itself remained unchanged, like a body that looked alive while its organs rotted. The buildings stood, the streets ran straight. The seasons came and went with predictable regularity. Only those who looked closely could see the signs of decay. The way shadows fell wrong, the way animals avoided certain areas, the way the air itself seemed to whisper with voices that had no source. The town's guilt had become a living thing, a psychic scar that fed on denial and grew stronger with each cycle. The books weren't simply enchanted objects, they were manifestations of this buried guilt, flesh-bound memoirs of generational rot that demanded acknowledgement. Each wave of revelations had been worse than the last, more violent, more destructive. The town's capacity for self-deception had grown stronger, but so had the force required to shatter it. The balance was shifting, and Clara could feel it in her bones. This cycle would be different. This time, the forgetting wouldn't come. Present day. Clara found herself back in the present, standing at the edge of the hollow with Mark Wallace's voice echoing in her memory. He had found Nathaniel Darren's journal, had pieced together the truth that the town had spent over a century trying to bury. Truth, once buried, feeds the hollow below, Darren had written in his final entry. Let none be fooled. This town was not saved. It was purchased. The price grows higher with each generation, and I fear what my descendants will be forced to pay. The journal had contained other revelations, details that painted a picture of a man who had realized too late what he had unleashed. Darren had seen Elara in his dreams before the bookstore had ever existed, had felt her presence watching him from the shadows as he'd made his desperate bargain. He had known, on some level, that she was not the entity he had summoned, but something else, a keeper of balances, a guardian of truths that humanity was too weak to face. She is not the origin of evil, he had written. She is its vessel, its warden. She preserves the balance between what is and what should be, between truth and comfortable lies. We called her here, but she was always going to come. Some truths are too heavy for the living to carry alone. Clara understood now. Ilara wasn't a villain or a saviour. She was something more complex and more terrible. She was the inevitable consequence of choices made in desperation, the price that had to be paid for the luxury of ignorance. The vision came as Clara knelt beside the hollow, pressing her palms against the cold earth. She saw Ilara as she truly was, not a woman at all, but a collection of memories and truths that had taken human form. She had been born from the collective guilt of humanity, shaped by the things that people couldn't bear to remember about themselves. In the vision, Ilara stood before her in the grey space between sleeping and waking, her form shifting and changing like smoke given substance. "I do not punish," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I remember. I do not burn. I open the pages you sealed shut. Every secret that has ever been buried, every truth that has ever been denied. They all come to me in the end." "Why?" Clara asked, though she knew the answer. "Because someone must. Because the alternative is worse than the disease. Your ancestors understood this, even if they couldn't admit it to themselves. They chose to forget their own darkness, to live in ignorance of their true nature. But ignorance has a price, and that price is me." Ilara reached out and touched Clara's face, her fingers cold as marble. "You are the last of Darren's line, the final payment on a debt that has been accumulating interest for over a century. Your family has carried this burden longer than most, and now it's time for you to choose. Choose what? Whether to break the cycle or become part of it. Whether to remember everything or forget it all. Whether to accept the truth of what you are or continue living the lie." Clara felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, the accumulated guilt of everyone who had ever lived in Eldridge settling on her shoulders like a shroud. She could feel the hollow responding to her presence, its darkness reaching up to embrace her. "The hollow has chosen a new keeper," Ilara said, her form beginning to fade. "This time, it remembers everything. This time, there will be no forgetting." Clara's eyes turned black as ink as she breathed in dust that smelled like burned paper and old blood. The transformation was complete, but it was only the beginning. The real work was about to start. Behind her, Eldridge continued its slow spiral into revelation, unaware that its newest keeper was already planning the final reckoning. The debts would be paid, the truths would be told, and the cycle that had defined the town for over a century would finally come to its inevitable end. But first, there were books to be opened, secrets to be revealed, and a community to be judged by the weight of its own accumulated darkness. Clara smiled, and in that smile was all the patience and mercilessness of the entity that had claimed her. The last chapter of Eldridge's story was about to be written, and she would be the one holding the pen. Chapter 8. Clara walked through the empty streets of Eldridge as the sun set behind clouds that had gathered like vultures over the dying town. The violence had escalated since the failed burning of the bookstore. 3 more deaths, dozens of injuries, and a growing sense that the community was tearing itself apart with the methodical precision of a surgical procedure. But Clara moved through the chaos untouched, her black eyes reflecting the flickering streetlights as she made her way toward the Keeper of Secrets. The book in her hands had grown heavier with each step, its pages now so thick with accumulated secrets that it barely resembled the volume she'd first opened. The whispers that rose from its pages had become a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison about truths that demanded acknowledgement. She had tried to resist this moment, had told herself that she could find another way. But the visions had made the futility of that hope clear. There was no other way. There never had been. The path had been laid out for her before she was born, carved into the fabric of reality by choices made in desperation over a century ago. The bookstore stood before her like a monument to inevitability, its windows glowing with that sourceless light that seemed to come from the books themselves. But as Clara approached, she could see that something fundamental had changed. The interior, visible through the glass, was no longer the maze of shelves and hidden corners she remembered. Now there was only one book, repeated endlessly throughout the space. Her book. Thousands of copies lining the walls, stacked on tables, floating in the air like pages torn from a divine manuscript. Each one whispered her name, called to her with voices that sounded like her own thoughts made audible. At the centre of it all stood Madame Elara, as still and patient as a statue carved from moonlight. She was waiting, had always been waiting, for this moment when the last descendant of the original pact would finally come to claim her inheritance. Clara pushed open the door, and the brass bell above the entrance chimed once. A sound like a funeral dirge played in a minor key. "You did this," Clara said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated fury and despair. "You turned them against each other. You made the books lie about who they really are." Elara regarded her with eyes that held the depth of centuries, her expression unchanged by the accusation. "I gave them their truth. It's not my fault they preferred lies." "Truth?" Clara laughed, but the sound was bitter as burnt coffee. "You call what's happening out there truth? People are dying, Elara. Families are destroying themselves over secrets that should have stayed buried. This isn't truth. It's cruelty disguised as enlightenment." "And what would you have me do?" Elara asked, her voice carrying the same gentle patience that had first drawn Clara to her. "Continue to let them live in ignorance. Allow them to pass their sins down to another generation and another until the weight of accumulated guilt crushes them entirely." Clara gestured toward the windows, where the glow of fires could be seen in the distance. "Look what your truth has accomplished. Look what you've brought to this place." "I brought them nothing they didn't already carry," Elara replied. "The capacity for violence, for betrayal, for cruelty, all of that was already there. I simply held up a mirror and showed them what they preferred not to see. The books don't just show the truth, they twist it, make it worse than it really is. They take normal human failures and turn them into unforgivable sins." Elara moved closer, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "Do they? Or do they simply show the full weight of actions that people have spent their lives minimizing? How many times have you heard someone say, 'I never meant to hurt anyone,' when they absolutely did mean to? How many times have you watched someone justify their cruelty by claiming they had no choice when they absolutely did?" Clara wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She thought of Emma falling from the ladder, of the moment of satisfaction she'd felt at her friend's pain. She thought of all the times she'd told herself it was an accident, that she'd tried to help, that the fault lay with the unstable ladder rather than her deliberate push. "The books don't lie," Clara whispered. "No," Elara agreed. "They don't. But people do, constantly and compulsively. They lie to themselves most of all, and those lies become poison that seeps into everything they touch." Clara walked deeper into the space, surrounded by endless copies of her own story. The whispers grew louder as she moved, voices speaking in harmony about guilt and shame and the weight of inherited sin. "Why me?" she asked. "Why was I chosen for this?" "Because you were born for it," Elara said simply. "Your great-great-grandmother was one of the original summoners in 1897, part of the group that made the pact to bind the hollow. The blood magic that sealed the agreement runs through your lineage, passed down from mother to daughter like a genetic curse." Clara felt the truth of it settling in her bones, heavy and inescapable. The whispers, the visions, the way I could always sense what people were hiding, none of that was madness. It was inheritance. Your family line was tasked with ensuring that the remembering would happen when the time came. Not to keep the peace, but to break it when the weight of collective denial became too great to bear. I never asked for this. Neither did your ancestors. But they made their choice, and now you must make yours. Clara turned to face Ilara, her black eyes reflecting the light from the floating books. What choice? You've made it clear that I don't have one. The town is destroying itself, and you're telling me it's my destiny to watch it burn. No, Ilara said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been sadness. I'm telling you it's your destiny to decide whether the burning leads to rebirth or complete destruction. Whether the truth you reveal becomes a foundation for something better or simply the final chapter in a story that was always doomed to end badly. Clara stared at her, seeing something in the older woman's expression that she'd never noticed before. Weariness, loneliness, the weight of centuries spent watching the same cycle repeat itself. What are you? Clara asked. I am what you will become, Ilara replied. A vessel for the town's forgotten truths, a keeper of the balance between what is and what should be. I am neither fully human nor entirely eternal. I am born each time the hollow awakens, sustained by the collective guilt of those who have chosen to forget. You're not the keeper. I am. You are meant to be. I have only been holding the place until the next descendant was ready to accept the burden. Clara felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders like a shroud. How long? How long what? How long will I have to do this? How long will I have to be the one who forces people to face the truth about themselves? Ilara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. Until the cycle is broken. Until humanity learns to face its own darkness without needing someone to force the confrontation. Until people choose truth over comfort of their own free will. That will never happen. Perhaps not, but that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to try. Clara walked to one of the floating books, watching as it opened itself to reveal pages covered in her own handwriting. The words spoke of Emma's fall, of the satisfaction she'd felt, of the lie she'd built her life around. But they also spoke of the years of guilt that had followed, the attempts to make amends, the gradual recognition that her cruelty had been a choice rather than an accident. Knowledge without guidance is cruelty, she said. These books tear people apart, but they don't offer any path toward redemption. They just reveal the darkness and leave people to drown in it. Knowledge is neither cruel nor kind, Ilara replied. It simply waits. And when it is ignored, it begins to rot, poisoning everything around it. The guidance you speak of can only come from within. No one can force another person to choose redemption over destruction. Then you're just passively watching people destroy themselves. You're not helping, you're just observing. And what would you have me do? Hold their hands while they confront their own sins? Offer them false comfort while they grapple with the consequences of their choices? There are worse things than secrets, Clara. One is silence, the other is ignorance. Clara felt anger flaring in her chest, hot and clean. So, you just stand by and watch? You don't try to help them find a way through the darkness? I am not their savior, neither are you. We are mirrors, Clara. We reflect what is already there. The choice of what to do with that reflection belongs to each individual. That's not good enough, Clara said, her voice rising. If I'm going to be the keeper, if I'm going to carry this burden, then I'm going to do it my way. I won't just reveal the truth, I'll guide them through it. I'll help them find a way to live with what they've done. And if they choose destruction anyway, then that's their choice to make. But at least they'll have been given the option. Ilara studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since Clara had met her, she smiled. A real smile, tinged with something that might have been hope. "You may be different from your predecessors," she said. "They all began with the same noble intentions, but the weight of what they witnessed eventually crushed their compassion. Perhaps you will find a way to bear the burden without losing your humanity." "I have to try." "Yes," Ilara agreed. "You do." Clara realized that the philosophical battle had shifted something fundamental within her. The town was beyond saving through comfort or gentle guidance. The lies that had sustained it for over a century had metastasized into something malignant, poisoning every relationship and every institution. Only through radical truth, through confrontation with the darkest aspects of human nature, could Eldridge be reborn. But she would not be passive in that confrontation. She would not simply stand by and watch as people destroyed themselves or each other. She would lead the reckoning, guide it towards something that might eventually resemble redemption. "The town needs to burn," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "But I'm going to make sure something grows from the ashes." "And how do you propose to do that?" "By being better than my predecessors. By refusing to let despair turn me into a passive observer. By remembering that even the darkest truths can be survived if people have help carrying them." Ilara nodded slowly. "Then you are ready to accept your inheritance." She reached into the folds of her grey dress and withdrew a book that Clara had never seen before. It was bound in leather that looked ancient but well cared for, and its pages were completely blank. The first blank book Clara had encountered in The Keeper of Secrets. "This is yours now," Ilara said, holding it out. "What you write next is yours to decide. But be warned, truth is a flame, and some will beg to burn rather than face what it reveals." Clara took the book, feeling its weight settle in her hands. The leather was warm to the touch, and she could sense the potential contained within its empty pages, the power to reveal, to judge, to guide. "What happens to you?" she asked. "I fade," Ilara said simply. "I return to the hollow, to the place where all forgotten truths eventually come to rest. I have carried this burden for long enough. It's time for someone else to take up the mantle." "Thank you," Clara said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you understand the full weight of what you've accepted. Then decide whether gratitude is appropriate." Clara walked toward the door, the blank book clutched against her chest. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the bookstore changing, shelves collapsing, books returning to the shadows, the very structure of the place reshaping itself for its new purpose. As she reached the threshold, she turned back to see Ilara one last time. The older woman was already becoming translucent, her form dissolving like smoke in the wind. "Clara," she called out, her voice fading. "Remember, the goal is not to punish, but to heal. The goal is not to destroy, but to rebuild. Don't let the darkness you witness turn you into something you'll regret becoming." "I won't," Clara promised, though she wondered if she would be able to keep that promise when the full weight of her responsibilities became clear. She stepped out into the night, and the door of the Keeper of Secrets closed behind her with a sound like a coffin being sealed. The building shuddered once, then fell silent, its windows dark for the first time since it had appeared. But the silence didn't last. As Clara walked away, she could hear voices rising from the town itself. Not whispers from books, but the sound of people calling out in fear and rage and desperate confusion. The storm that had been gathering all week was finally ready to break. Clara looked up at the sky, where clouds swirled in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Lightning flickered within them, but it was the wrong colour. Not the blue-white of natural electricity, but the deep red of old blood. She opened her blank book and felt the weight of possibility settle on her shoulders. The first words appeared on the page as she watched, written in her own handwriting. "The reckoning is no longer coming. It's here." Clara smiled, and in that smile was all the terrible purpose of someone who had finally accepted their destiny. She had work to do, truth to reveal, and a community to guide through the fire of their own making. The real horror was just beginning. But for the first time since this had all started, Clara felt ready to face it. Chapter 9. The screaming started at dawn. Not human voices, but the books themselves, their pages shrieking as they flipped in winds that touched nothing else, their bindings creaking like bones under pressure. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching Mrs. Chen stumble out of her house, with fresh burns covering her forearm. The words, "I watched my daughter drown," branded into her flesh in script that looked disturbingly familiar. Eldridge had crossed a threshold in the night. The whispers were over. Clara moved through the chaos with purpose, her blank book pressed against her chest like armor. She'd spent the pre-dawn hours posting notices throughout the town, not requests, but summons written in her own blood when ink had refused to take to paper. Tonight, town hall, speak, or the hollow will. The transformation was complete now. She could feel the weight of inherited authority settling into her bones, could sense the threads of guilt and fear that connected every soul in Eldridge like a web of shared damnation. Some threads were ready to snap, their bearers eager for the release that truth might bring. Others had wound themselves so tightly around their secrets that cutting them loose might prove fatal. But that was no longer her concern. She was the keeper now, and the keeper's duty was to the truth, not to those too weak to bear it. The town hall felt like a courtroom as evening approached, its familiar warmth replaced by the cold anticipation of judgment. 40 souls had answered her summons, clutching their books like evidence in their own trials. The atmosphere was electric with terror and desperate hope, the air itself seeming to thicken as secrets pressed against the walls like living things demanding release. Mark Wallace sat in the back row, his notebook forgotten beside him. He'd come as both witness and participant, understanding that his role as chronicler had evolved into something more immediate. His book lay open on his lap, its pages still dark with the story of professional compromises that had cost 6 people their lives. The lights flickered as Clara entered, and she felt the collective intake of breath as 40 pairs of eyes fixed on her. She had changed. They could all see it. Her movements were too fluid, her gaze too knowing, her presence too heavy with authority that came from sources older than human civilization. She placed her blank book on the table beneath the American flag, its pages falling open to reveal words that wrote themselves as she watched. The time for secrets has ended. The time for judgment has begun. Clara studied the assembled faces, reading their guilt like fingerprints, seeing the weight of their hidden sins pressing down on them like gravitational forces. Some leaned forward, ready to unburden themselves. Others sat rigid with denial, their faces set in masks of defensive rage. "We are dying," she said, her voice carrying without effort through the silence, not from disease or disaster, but from the poison of unspoken truth. Every secret we carry eats at us from within. Every lie we tell ourselves makes us smaller and meaner and more afraid. She gestured to the books that filled the room, their pages rustling with anticipation. These aren't curses, they're mirrors. They show us what we've always been, what we've always known about ourselves but have been too cowardly to acknowledge. Margaret Flores clutched her book tighter, her knuckles white with strain. "You're saying we deserve this? That we deserve to have our lives destroyed?" "I'm saying your lives were already destroyed," Clara replied, her black eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like pools of oil. "You've been walking corpses for years, animated by nothing but habit and fear. The only question now is whether you'll choose to live again or continue rotting where you stand." She opened her blank book, and words began appearing on its pages as she spoke. Not her words, but observations written in a hand that looked ancient and patient. "The truth is already here, eating at you, demanding acknowledgement. I'm not here to force confessions. I'm here to offer you the chance to stop carrying weights that were never meant to be borne in silence." Clara's voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its terrible authority. "Speak your truth. Choose redemption, or the Hollow will choose for you." The silence stretched until Jessica Martinez broke it, rising on unsteady legs. She was a mother of 3 who had always seemed to have her life perfectly ordered, but now she trembled like a leaf in a hurricane. "I destroyed my daughter's life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a fire in our garage. I was smoking, knocked over paint thinner. The whole place burned down. When they asked what happened, I said I didn't know. Emma had been playing with matches the day before, so everyone assumed—" Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Emma was 11. She spent 2 years convinced she was a monster, that everything bad that happened was her fault. She still apologizes for breathing too loud. I broke my own child because I was too selfish to face consequences." As Jessica spoke, her book began to change. The blood-red words faded to grey, then to nothing, until the pages showed only blank paper. The weight that had been crushing her shoulders for years seemed to lift, and she sank back into her chair with a gasp of relief. "I'll tell her tonight," Jessica whispered. "I'll tell her everything." Clara nodded once. "Actions matter more than words. What will you do with this truth?" "Whatever it takes to help her heal." The dam broke. One by one, people stood to unburden themselves of secrets that had been festering in darkness for years. Thomas Brennan admitted to embezzling from the Veterans Fund, his voice steady as he detailed 15 years of theft justified by his daughter's college tuition and his own gambling debts. His book crumbled to ash as he spoke, the pages dissolving like dreams in daylight. Linda Reynolds confessed to the affair that had poisoned her relationship with her sister, the words coming out in a rush of grief and self-loathing. She and Martha embraced for the first time in decades, their shared pain finally acknowledged. Jamie Rourke, barely 18, sobbed as he admitted to bullying a classmate into suicide, his young face aged by 2 years of carrying unbearable guilt. His book burst into flames that somehow didn't burn, consuming itself in clean fire that left only empty air behind. With each confession, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Those who had spoken found themselves surrounded by warmth that seemed to come from within, their books fading or disintegrating as their secrets were finally exposed to light. The air grew thick and expectant, as if something vast and patient were listening from beneath the floorboards. But not everyone was ready for redemption. Richard Blackwood had been watching the proceedings with growing disgust, his weathered face twisted into a mask of contempt. As the town's wealthiest landowner, he had built his fortune through methods that his book detailed with uncomfortable precision. Bribes, cover-ups, safety violations that had cost lives. "Enough," he said, rising to his feet with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is mass hysteria, nothing more. We're letting this woman manipulate us into destroying everything we've built." Several others nodded agreement, their faces set in stubborn denial. They had come hoping to find some way to fight back, to reclaim their carefully constructed lives. Blackwood's voice grew stronger, more confident. "These books aren't truth. They're psychological warfare. This woman has somehow accessed our private information and is using it to control us. I won't be part of this witch trial." But there was something hollow in his denial, something that rang false even to his own ears. Clara watched him with the patience of a predator, seeing the fear beneath his bluster. "My book claims I've covered up safety violations that killed workers," Blackwood continued, his voice rising. "It says I've bribed inspectors, threatened witnesses, destroyed evidence. But these are lies, fabrications designed to—" He stopped mid-sentence as his book began to bleed. Not metaphorically, but literally. Dark red liquid seeping from its pages, pooling on the floor, forming words in flowing script that spelled out names, dates, and amounts in perfect detail. The cut on Blackwood's hand, opened by the book's sharp edges when he'd tried to destroy it days earlier, began bleeding in synchronization with the pages. His life force was mingling with the truth he was trying to deny, creating a ledger written in blood and guilt. "The book bleeds," someone whispered, and the words rippled through the room like a prayer. Clara stood, her presence filling the space like smoke. "The books can't lie, Mr. Blackwood. They're incapable of it. If you see lies in those pages, it's because you've been lying to yourself for so long that truth feels foreign to you." Blackwood's face had gone pale, but his jaw remained set in defiance. "I won't be intimidated by parlor tricks and mob mentality." "Then leave," Clara said simply, "but understand that walking away from truth doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it hungrier." Blackwood and his supporters filed out, their books growing darker with each step. As they passed through the doorway, Clara could hear the volumes beginning to whisper again, louder and more insistent than ever before, demanding acknowledgement that would not be denied much longer. Mark Wallace had been silent through the entire proceeding, his notebook forgotten as he watched his neighbours strip away decades of careful pretense. His own book lay open beside him, its pages filled with the story of his greatest professional failure. Finally he stood, his hands shaking as he found his voice. "6 people died because of me," he said, the words coming out like broken glass. "A factory fire that I covered up. I had evidence that the owner knew about the safety violations, that he'd been warned repeatedly. But he was my friend, someone who'd helped my career." The room listened in complete silence as Mark's voice grew stronger with each admission. "I wrote the story to make it look like an accident. I buried the inspector reports, omitted the whistleblower testimony, protected a man who chose profit over human life. 3 of the victims had children. 1 was pregnant. They all died because I chose loyalty over truth." As he spoke, his book disintegrated, its pages turning to ash that drifted away like snow. The weight that had been crushing him for years began to lift, and for the first time since the fire, he felt like he might be able to sleep without hearing voices. "I'll write the real story," he said. "I'll publish it, whatever it costs me." Clara nodded, her expression filled with something that might have been approval. "Then you've remembered who you're meant to be." As the meeting drew to a close, Clara could feel the change in the town's spiritual atmosphere. Some of the poison had been drawn out, some of the festering wounds had been cleaned and exposed to healing light. But she could also sense that deeper work remained, that some secrets were still hiding in the darkness. The wind outside had died completely, leaving the night unnaturally still. Even the insects had fallen silent, as if the entire landscape were holding its breath in anticipation of what was coming. Clara packed her book, no longer blank, but filled with the names and stories of those who had chosen truth over comfort. As she prepared to leave, she heard something that made her blood sing with recognition. A whisper rose from the ground beneath her feet, seeping up through the floorboards like the voice of the earth itself. Some still remain. Some still must pay. She looked toward the windows, beyond which the woods stretched dark and waiting. In the distance she could see a faint glow emanating from the direction of the hollow, not the warm light of redemption, but the cold radiance of something ancient stirring to wakefulness. As she watched, a door opened in the base of the depression, not a physical door, but a threshold to somewhere deeper and darker than the world above. Something was awakening in the depths, something that had been patient, but was now ready to collect debts that voluntary confession could not satisfy. Clara smiled, and in that smile was all the terrible purpose of someone who had fully accepted their role as both shepherd and wolf. The healing had begun for those who could accept it, but the reckoning was just beginning for those who could not. The real work lay ahead, and some of it would require tools sharper than words. Chapter 10. Clara walked through the pre-dawn darkness as if pulled by invisible threads, her feet finding the forest path without conscious direction. The town lay behind her in uneasy sleep, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of candlelight from those too afraid to trust electric illumination. The confessions at the town hall had changed something fundamental in Eldridge's spiritual atmosphere, but Clara could sense that the work was far from complete. The whispers had started again before midnight, not from any book, but from the earth itself, calling her name in voices that predated human language. They drew her deeper into the woods, past the familiar landmarks, toward the ancient depression where it had all begun. The hollow spread before her like a wound in the world, its perfectly circular rim catching the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy above. But tonight, something was different. At the center of the depression, beneath a gnarled oak whose roots twisted through the black soil like grasping fingers, Clara could see the outline of something that hadn't been there before. She descended the slope carefully, feeling the temperature drop with each step until her breath misted in the air. The soil was warm beneath her feet despite the chill, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. As she approached the ancient tree, she could see what had called her here. A book lay half buried in the rich earth, its leather binding dark as old blood. Unlike every other volume she'd encountered, this one bore no title, only a single phrase etched in gold letters that seemed to glow with their own light. What is forgiven may be freed. Clara knelt beside the book, her hands trembling as she brushed away the soil that clung to its cover. The leather was warm to the touch, and she could feel something moving beneath the binding. Not pages turning, but something alive and patient waiting to be awakened. When she opened the final book, its pages were blank as fresh snow. But as thoughts of Eldridge filled her mind, images of the townspeople, their struggles, their secrets, words began to appear on the pristine paper. Not a story this time, but something that looked like instructions written in flowing script that seemed to move and shift as she read. The sins of the fathers echo through generations, the first line read. The silence of the children feeds the darkness. Only through willing truth can the cycle be broken. Only through collective confession can the debt be paid. Clara read on, her heart sinking as she understood what was being asked. This wasn't simply another revelation of hidden secrets. It was a ritual, a test of collective will that would require every remaining soul in Eldridge to participate. Each person would need to speak their deepest truth aloud, freely, and without coercion, in the presence of the entire community. If even one lies, if even one holds back the essential truth, the binding remains. The curse endures. The hollow hungers. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a mountain. How could she ask this of them? How could she demand that an entire community strip itself bare before each other, knowing that some truths were too terrible to bear? The burden is heavy, isn't it? Clara spun around to find Madame Elara standing at the edge of the tree's shadow, but this wasn't the composed, ageless woman she'd known. Elara looked ancient now, her form translucent as morning mist, her dark hair streaked with silver that seemed to move in a breeze Clara couldn't feel. "You're dying," Clara said, and it wasn't a question. "I am fading," Elara corrected gently. "My purpose is nearly complete. The role of keeper has passed to you, and with it, the choice of how to use the power you've inherited." She moved closer, her footsteps making no sound on the rich earth. "This book cannot be read, Clara. It must be lived. The ritual it describes has been attempted before but never completed. Always someone would hold back, would choose their secret over their community's salvation. What if they refuse? What if I can't convince them? Then the curse continues. The cycle repeats. Another generation will grow up carrying the weight of their parents' silence and their children after them, until the accumulated guilt becomes too heavy for the town to bear. Ilara's form grew fainter with each word. But you are different from those who came before. You have the will to complete what others could only begin. The question is whether you have the courage to accept the price. What price? Truth is not free, Clara. It demands payment from those who would wield it. Complete this ritual, and you will become something more than human, and less. You will be bound to this place, this purpose, until another is ready to take your place. Clara looked down at the final book, its pages now filled with detailed instructions for the ritual that would either save or damn them all. How long? As long as it takes. Perhaps decades. Perhaps centuries. Time moves differently for the keeper. The book grew heavier in Clara's hands as doubt crept into her heart, its binding warming until it was almost too hot to hold. She could feel it feeding on her uncertainty, drawing strength from her fear. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Neither did your ancestors," Ilara replied. "But they tried anyway because the alternative was worse than the risk." Clara stayed in the hollow until dawn, reading and rereading the ritual instructions until she had memorized every word. The requirements were specific and unforgiving. The ceremony had to take place beneath the hollow on the night of the new moon, tonight, and every participant had to speak their truth willingly, without coercion or force. As the sun rose, she made her way back to town, carrying the final book like a sacred text. The streets were beginning to stir with life, but the normalcy felt fragile, like a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. She found Mark Wallace at the newspaper office, surrounded by boxes of old records and yellowed documents. He looked up as she entered, his eyes immediately drawn to the book in her hands. "You found something," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The final piece," Clara confirmed, "but I need your help. Have you found anything else about the original ritual? Any details about what the founders actually did?" Mark gestured to a torn page lying on his desk, its edges brown with age. "This was hidden in the binding of Nathaniel Darren's journal. I only found it this morning when the leather finally gave way." Clara read the faded text, her heart racing as she absorbed its implications. When the final book opens, it must be read where the curse was made, beneath the hollow, on the night of new moon. All who partake must come willingly, and all must speak truly, or the binding will not hold. If we fail in this, the debt will pass to our children, and their children after them, until someone has the strength to pay what we could not. "Tonight," Clara whispered. "It has to be tonight," Mark nodded grimly. "The new moon. No light, except what we bring ourselves." Clara felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a shroud. "Will you help me? Will you help me gather them?" "Of course. But Clara, are you ready for this? Are you ready for what you'll become if the ritual succeeds?" She looked down at the final book, its pages now glowing with soft light that seemed to come from within the paper itself. "I don't think anyone could ever be ready for this, but I can't let the cycle continue. I won't condemn another generation to carry our sins." The words spread through Eldridge like wildfire, carried by whispers and meaningful glances, by notes slipped under doors and messages left on answering machines. Clara didn't need to explain the importance of what she was asking. Everyone could feel it in the air, could sense that this was their last chance to break free from the weight that had been crushing them for generations. As darkness fell, they came. Not all of them. Richard Blackwood and his supporters had barricaded themselves in their homes, choosing defiance over redemption. But 43 souls made the trek through the woods, carrying flashlights and candles, clutching their books or the ash that remained of them. They gathered at the rim of the hollow as the last light faded from the sky, forming a circle around the ancient depression. Clara could see the fear in their faces, but also something else. Hope, fragile but growing stronger with each passing moment. She descended into the hollow, carrying the final book and a single white candle that cast dancing shadows on the twisted roots of the oak tree. The assembled townspeople followed, arranging themselves in a spiral that led down to where Clara stood at the centre. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through leaves and the soft sound of pages turning as people opened their books one final time. Clara opened the final book to the first page, where the ritual instructions glowed with golden light. Her voice carried clearly through the still air as she spoke the opening words. "We are the children of silence. Tonight, we choose to speak." The book's pages turned on their own, revealing new text that hadn't been there moments before. Clara read from the glowing script, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We gather in this place where our ancestors made their bargain with darkness. We gather to speak the truths that have been buried, to acknowledge the sins that have been denied, to free ourselves from the chains of inherited guilt." One by one, the townspeople began to confess. But these weren't just personal secrets, they were family secrets, generational wounds passed down in silence, betrayals that had echoed through decades. Jessica Martinez spoke of her grandmother's murder, covered up to protect a family member who'd gone on to hurt others. Thomas Brennan revealed that his father had sold contaminated grain to feed refugee children during the war, caring more about profit than the lives he was destroying. Margaret Flores admitted that her family had built their fortune on stolen land, forcing out native families through violence and legal trickery that had never been acknowledged or atoned for. Each confession caused the final book to glow brighter, its pages turning without Clara's touch as the ritual progressed. The air grew thick and warm, charged with the energy of secrets finally exposed to light. The resistance came from an unexpected source. William Graves, a quiet man who'd lost his family in a car accident years earlier, stood frozen when his turn came. His book lay open in his hands, its pages dark with secrets he couldn't bring himself to voice. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't say it. Not out loud. Not where they can hear." The final book began to pulse with heat, its glow flickering as the ritual faltered. Clara could feel the hollow responding, sensing weakness, preparing to claim what was denied. "William," she said gently, "whatever it is, we're here to listen. We're here to forgive." But he shook his head, backing away from the circle. "You don't understand. What I did, there's no forgiveness for it. There's no redemption." His book burst into flames in his hands, but these weren't the clean fires of confession. They were black flames that consumed without light, eating at his flesh as he screamed. The earth beneath his feet cracked open, and shadowy tendrils reached up to drag him down into the darkness below. His brother David lunged forward, trying to grab William's hand, but it was too late. The hollow swallowed him whole, the earth closing over the spot where he'd stood as if he'd never existed at all. David knelt where his brother had vanished, tears streaming down his face. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite his grief. "William killed our father," he said. "Pushed him down the stairs during an argument about money. I helped him hide the body, helped him stage the scene to look like an accident. We've been covering for each other for 20 years, and the guilt was eating him alive." David's book crumbled to ash in his hands, but the ash was white and clean, drifting away on a breeze that smelled of roses and forgiveness. "I failed to save my brother, but I won't fail to tell his truth." The final book turned another page, its light growing brighter as the ritual continued. When the last confession was spoken, when the final truth had been acknowledged and accepted, the hollow shuddered like a living thing awakening from a long sleep. The books in everyone's hands disintegrated, some dissolving into pure light that rose toward the stars, others crumbling to dust that was quickly scattered by the wind. The ancient oak at the center of the depression began to burn with ghostly fire that cast no heat, its twisted roots glowing like veins of molten gold. A shockwave of wind rolled across the clearing, carrying with it the sound of chains breaking and voices sighing in relief. Madame Ilara appeared one last time, standing beside Clara with a smile that held centuries of patience, finally rewarded. "You've done what I could not," she whispered, her voice already fading. "You've given them the chance to choose redemption over damnation." She began to crumble, her form dissolving into ash that was caught by the wind and scattered among the stars. "Thank you," Clara heard her say as the last of her essence drifted away. The final book closed with a sound like thunder, its covers sealing shut as the ritual reached its completion. When Clara looked down at it, she saw that a new title had appeared on the leather binding, etched in letters that glowed like captured starlight: "The Keeper of Secrets, Clara Whitmore." She looked up to find the townspeople watching her with a mixture of awe and gratitude, their faces cleaned by tears and transformed by the weight of truth finally spoken. Around them, the woods were silent, except for the sound of wind through leaves, natural sounds, peaceful sounds, free of the whispers that had haunted them for so long. In the distance, Clara could see the lights of Eldridge glowing warm and welcoming. But when she looked toward where the Keeper of Secrets had stood, she saw only an empty lot where weeds grew in soil that looked as if it had never been disturbed. The bookstore was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Clara opened the final book one more time and found a single fresh page, blank except for words that appeared as she watched. "Truth is a seed. It always grows back." She understood now. The cycle wasn't broken. It was transformed. The truth would always demand acknowledgement, secrets would always seek exposure, and someone would always be needed to guide that process. The keeper's role wasn't to prevent the accumulation of guilt, but to ensure that it was dealt with before it could poison another generation. Clara closed the book and began to walk back toward town, toward the life that awaited her as the new guardian of uncomfortable truths. Behind her, the hollow began to fill with fresh soil, green grass already sprouting in the rich earth where the ancient oak had stood. The curse was broken, but the responsibility remained. And Clara Whitmore, the last daughter of Ezra's line, was finally ready to carry it. Chapter 11. The black sky above Eldridge held no moon, no stars, only an endless void that seemed to press down on the town like a held breath. Clara stood at the edge of the hollow, the final book clutched against her chest, feeling the weight of 43 souls gathering behind her in the darkness. They had come as she'd asked, carrying flashlights and candles, but even their combined light seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness that had settled over the woods. The hollow itself had changed since the previous night. The depression seemed deeper now, its perfectly circular walls carved with symbols that hadn't been there before, ancient markings that hurt to look at directly, as if they were written in a language that predated human comprehension. At the centre, where the gnarled oak had stood, a pit had opened in the earth, descending into darkness so complete it seemed solid. Clara could feel something vast and patient stirring beneath their feet, something that had been waiting for this moment since the town's founding. The ground vibrated faintly with each heartbeat, each breath, as if the earth itself were alive and anticipating. "The time has come," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "Tonight, we face the reckoning that our ancestors postponed. Tonight, we pay the debt that has been accumulating for generations." She opened the final book, and its pages blazed with internal light that cast dancing shadows on the faces of the assembled townspeople. The blank pages of the previous evening were now filled with names and lines of text, each entry glowing with its own particular radiance, some warm and golden, others cold and blue, a few pulsing with an angry red that seemed to burn the paper. "These are not accusations," Clara continued, her black eyes reflecting the book's light like pools of oil. They are keys. Read them aloud. Speak the truth that has been written in your heart, or stay locked in the dark forever. The first to step forward was Margaret Flores, her weathered face set in lines of grim determination. She had been carrying her secrets for 70 years, and the weight of them had bent her spine and lined her face with premature age. Margaret Flores, she read from the glowing page, you watched your brother burn and did nothing to save him. Her voice broke as she continued. Danny was only 8. He was playing with matches in the barn, and when the hay caught fire, I could have gotten him out. But I was angry with him. Angry because he'd broken my doll earlier that day. I stood there and watched him scream for help, and I did nothing until it was too late. As Margaret spoke, the ground beneath her feet began to glow with soft golden light that spread outward like ripples in a pond. The weight that had been crushing her shoulders for decades seemed to lift, and she stood straighter than she had in years. I've carried that guilt my whole life, she whispered. I've punished myself every day for 70 years, but I never spoke his name aloud. I never acknowledged what I'd done. The light beneath her feet pulsed once, then faded to a warm, steady glow. Margaret's page in the final book went blank, the words dissolving into sparkles of light that drifted away on the wind. One by one, the others followed. Thomas Brennan stepped forward to read his truth about the contaminated grain, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. Jessica Martinez confessed to the fire she'd blamed on her daughter, her words coming out in a rush of grief and self-forgiveness. With each confession, the atmosphere in the hollow grew more charged. The air became thick and hot, sharp with the electricity of impending storm. Some people fainted from the intensity, their bodies unable to process the supernatural energy that was building around them. Linda Reynolds coughed up ink, thick black liquid that splattered on the ground and began to form words in an ancient script. But not everyone was ready to face their truth. Richard Blackwood stood at the edge of the circle, his face twisted with rage and denial. His page in the final book was burning, not with golden light, but with flames that consumed nothing, leaving the words intact but surrounded by fire. I won't be part of this, he snarled. I won't let myself be destroyed by lies and manipulation. He tried to turn away, to flee back through the woods, but his feet wouldn't move. The earth beneath him had turned to quicksand, holding him in place while his page in the book grew brighter and more insistent. Richard Blackwood, Clara read aloud, her voice carrying the authority of judgment. You knew the mine was unsafe. You knew the supports were failing. You sent 23 men to their deaths because replacing the supports would have cost you money. Lies, Blackwood screamed, but his mouth began to seal shut, invisible threads pulling his lips together as the truth demanded acknowledgement. Another man, Harold Vance, tried to run as his turn approached. He made it 3 steps before collapsing to the ground, his body convulsing as shadows poured from his eyes like tears. The truth he'd been hiding, the children he'd hurt, the lives he'd destroyed, spilled out of him in a torrent of darkness that left him empty and broken on the forest floor. The truth will be spoken, Clara said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. By your voice or by the voice of the darkness you've fed. The choice is yours. Mark Wallace stepped forward before his name was called, his notebook forgotten in his other hand. He had been watching the proceedings with the eye of a journalist, but now he understood that he was no longer an observer. He was a participant in the town's final accounting. Mark Wallace, he read from the glowing page, you have made a career of selling truth to the highest bidder. But he didn't stop there. He turned the page, and another, reading confession after confession, stories of bribes accepted, evidence buried, witnesses silenced. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, but Mark's voice never wavered. The factory fire was just the beginning, he said, his words coming out in a steady stream of self-condemnation. I've covered up murders, hidden evidence of corruption. destroyed lives to protect my sources and my career. I've been a journalist in name only. In practice, I've been a weapon for those with enough money to buy my silence. The ground around him began to crack and smoke, but not with condemnation, with relief. The truth was setting him free, burning away the accumulated guilt and shame that had been poisoning his soul for decades. As he finished reading, his page in the final book burst into clean flame and crumbled to ash. For the first time in 20 years, Mark felt whole. The voices that had been whispering in his ears since the factory fire, the voices of the 23 men who had died because of his complicity, finally fell silent. Clara nodded to him, and he understood that his role in the town's healing was complete. He was no longer the chronicler of other people's stories. He was the author of his own redemption. The final book had grown thin as name after name was called, confession after confession was made. The supernatural energy in the hollow had reached fever pitch, with ghostly whispers rising from the soil and shadows moving independently of their sources. The trees around the depression creaked and groaned as if they were in pain, their branches reaching toward the starless sky like supplicating arms. Finally, only one page remained. Clara looked down at it, and her blood ran cold as she read her own name written in letters that seemed to burn with their own light. Clara Whitmore, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. You must forgive yourself for what was never yours to carry. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she staggered backward as memories flooded through her mind. Her mother's death, her father's abandonment, the years of loneliness and self-blame that had shaped her into someone who carried other people's guilt, as if it were her own. I thought I was responsible for everything, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I thought my mother died because I wasn't good enough to make her want to live. I thought my father left because I was too much trouble, too much of a burden. I've been carrying guilt that was never mine to bear, taking responsibility for choices that other people made. As she spoke, the hollow groaned like a beast exhaling its final breath. The oppressive darkness above began to lift, revealing stars that shone with unusual brilliance. The pit at the center of the depression began to close, the earth healing itself as the truth finally set everyone free. I forgive myself, Clara said, and her voice carried across the woods like a bell tolling the end of an age. I forgive myself for being human, for being imperfect, for carrying burdens that were never mine to bear. The final book closed itself with a sound like thunder, its covers sealing shut as the ritual reached its completion. For a moment it hung in the air above Clara's outstretched hands, glowing with the accumulated light of all the truths that had been spoken. Then it disintegrated into pure radiance, its essence dispersing among the stars like the souls of the forgiven. The silence that followed was profound, not the oppressive quiet of secrets held, but the peaceful stillness of truth, finally acknowledged. The supernatural energy that had been building throughout the evening dissipated like morning mist, leaving behind only the natural sounds of wind through leaves and the distant call of night birds. Clara looked out at the assembled townspeople, seeing them clearly for the first time. They were no longer the guilt-ridden, shame-haunted individuals who had gathered at the hollow's edge. They were human beings who had faced their darkness and chosen to step into the light. This place will never forget, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. But we can choose not to fear remembering. We can choose to learn from our mistakes rather than being destroyed by them. The silence stretched for a long moment, and then someone began to clap. Margaret Florris, her face streaked with tears, but somehow younger than it had been in decades. The applause spread through the crowd, growing stronger and more celebratory as the full weight of their liberation settled over them. They had done it. They had faced the reckoning that their ancestors had postponed, had paid the debt that had been accumulating for generations. The curse was broken not through violence or sacrifice, but through the simple act of speaking truth and accepting forgiveness. The earth beneath their feet stopped rumbling. The strange heat that had been building throughout the evening lifted, replaced by a cool breeze that carried the scent of new growth. The books that had tormented them for weeks vanished in soft flashes of light, leaving behind only the memory of the truths they had contained. As the crowd began to disperse, walking back toward town under a sky filled with stars, Clara heard a familiar voice whisper one last time on the wind. What is faced can be forgiven. What is denied must return. Madame Ilara's words carried no menace now, only gentle wisdom. The cycle of secrets and shame had been broken, but the responsibility remained. The responsibility to face truth honestly, to speak it clearly, and to forgive both others and themselves for the simple fact of being human. Clara stood alone at the hollow's edge as the last of the townspeople disappeared into the woods. The depression was already beginning to heal, grass sprouting from the rich soil, and at its center, where the pit had opened, a small sapling grew. Its leaves shimmered faintly in the starlight, and Clara knew that it would grow into something beautiful, a reminder of the truth that had been planted here and the redemption that had grown from it. She took a deep breath, feeling the clean night air fill her lungs, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The weight of inherited guilt had been lifted. The burden of other people's secrets had been shared and transformed into something healing rather than destructive. The truth had bloomed, and for the first time in generations, Eldridge exhaled. As Clara walked back toward town, she could see lights in windows that had been dark for weeks, could hear the sound of laughter and conversation drifting on the night air. The town was healing, its people learning to live with truth rather than in spite of it. Behind her, the hollow settled into peaceful slumber, its ancient hunger finally satisfied. The reckoning was complete, and the future, uncertain but honest, stretched out before them like a path illuminated by starlight. Chapter 12. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window for the first time in weeks. The quality of light was different, cleaner somehow, unfiltered by the oppressive atmosphere that had blanketed Eldridge since the arrival of the Keeper of Secrets. She dressed quickly and walked to her kitchen window, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. The bookstore was fading. What had stood solid and imposing for weeks was now translucent as morning mist, its dark wood and impossible architecture wavering like a mirage. Clara could see through its walls to the vacant lot that lay beneath, could watch the grass that had never grown there beginning to push through the soil. By the time the sun reached its zenith, she knew there would be nothing left but empty space and the lingering sense that something immense had once stood there. She made coffee and sat on her porch, watching the town wake up around her. The change was subtle but profound. People emerged from their homes without the hunched shoulders and furtive glances that had characterized their movements for weeks. Mrs. Chen waved to her from across the street, her arm unbandaged, the terrible words that had been burned into her flesh, now nothing more than a faint scar that looked like old lace. Neighbors spoke to each other over fences, their conversations carrying the easy rhythm of people who no longer feared what they might accidentally reveal. Children's laughter echoed from the code playground for the first time since the crisis began, pure and uncomplicated by the weight of adult secrets. The Eldridge Sentinel's morning edition lay on Clara's doorstep, its headline reading, "We Remember Ourselves," in bold black letters. Mark Wallace's column filled the entire front page, his words capturing something that Clara had felt but hadn't been able to articulate. Yesterday we were a town of strangers living in the same place, each of us isolated by the weight of what we couldn't say. Today we are a community of human beings who have chosen to remember that being flawed doesn't make us unworthy of love, it makes us real. The healing won't be easy. Some wounds cut too deep to mend quickly, and some relationships may never recover from the truths that were revealed. But we've learned something precious, that shame loses its power when it's shared, that secrets lose their bite when they're spoken aloud, and that forgiveness of others and ourselves is not a luxury, but a necessity. We are the same people we were a month ago, with the same histories, the same mistakes, the same capacity for both cruelty and kindness. The difference is that now we know it, and in knowing, we've found the possibility of choosing differently. Clara folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. Mark had found his voice again, and it was stronger than ever. The morning brought visitors, people who had participated in the reckoning and others who had watched from the sidelines, all of them seeking something they couldn't quite name. They sat on Clara's porch and talked, not about secrets this time, but about the ordinary mysteries of human existence: love, loss, hope, fear, and the thousand small choices that shape a life. Margaret Flores brought cookies and stayed for an hour, speaking about her brother Danny for the first time in 70 years. Not about his death, but about his life, his laughter, his dreams of becoming a pilot. The guilt was still there, but it was no longer the only truth she carried about him. Jessica Martinez came with her daughter Emma, both of them awkward but determined to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than protection. They had work to do, but they were doing it together. Some homes remained empty. Some families were still struggling to process the revelations that had torn through their lives like tornadoes. But there was a difference now, a willingness to face the pain directly rather than hiding from it, to seek help rather than suffer in silence. Clara watched a woman place flowers on the steps of the house where her sister had confessed to decades of theft and betrayal. By evening, someone had added a candle to the small memorial. By the next morning, there was a note: "We love you anyway." As the sun began to set, Clara found herself walking toward the hollow, drawn by the same impulse that had guided her throughout the entire ordeal. The depression looked different in the golden light of evening, smaller somehow, more like a natural feature of the landscape than a wound in the earth. The cursed oak was gone completely, leaving behind only a young sapling with leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Clara knelt beside it and placed her hand on its slender trunk, feeling warmth that came not from the sun, but from within the tree itself, the warmth of life growing in soil that had been enriched by truth rather than poisoned by lies. The hollow was no longer feeding on pain. It was at rest, its ancient hunger satisfied by the feast of honesty that had been offered freely rather than extracted by force. The earth here would be fertile for generations to come, nourished by the courage of those who had chosen to face their darkness rather than flee from it. That night, Clara made her way to where the Keeper of Secrets had stood, finding it now nothing more than a shadow against the starlit sky. But inside that shadow she could see a familiar figure waiting for her. Madame Elara, translucent as spun glass, her voice like the whisper of turning pages. "You came," Elara said, and her smile held centuries of gratitude. "I had to see you one more time," Clara replied, "to understand what comes next." "What comes next is up to you," Elara said gently. "The role of keeper is not a prison sentence. It's a choice that must be made anew each day. You can choose to carry the weight of other people's secrets, or you can choose to help them carry their own." She moved closer, and Clara could see that she was fading with each passing moment, her form becoming more ethereal as the night deepened. "Secrets do not wish to harm," Elara continued. "They only want to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be given their proper place in the story of a life. It is shame that twists them into monsters, fear that transforms them into weapons." She reached into the folds of her disappearing dress and withdrew a single blank page, crisp and white, with edges that seemed to glow with their own light. "This is the last remnant of the final book," she said, pressing it into Clara's hands. "But you are not the keeper of secrets, Clara Whitmore. You are the keeper of memory. Don't let them forget that truth is not the enemy. The refusal to face truth is what causes suffering." As the first rays of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Ilara began to fade more rapidly, her form dissolving like morning mist in sunlight. But her voice remained strong and clear as she spoke her final words. "Truth is a garden. Let it grow wild if it must, but let it grow." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of old paper and the echo of wisdom that had taken centuries to learn. Clara stood alone in the empty lot, holding the blank page that represented both an ending and a beginning. She understood now what her true role was meant to be. Not the guardian of hidden things, but the keeper of memory, the one who would help people remember that their stories, all of their stories, mattered. She would not build another bookstore filled with secrets. Instead, she would create a library of memory, a place where people could come to share their truths without fear of judgment, where the stories of their lives could be preserved and honored rather than buried in shame. The transformation of Eldridge didn't happen overnight. Healing, Clara had learned, was not a destination but a journey, one that required daily choices and ongoing commitment. But the foundation had been laid, and people were building on it with increasing confidence. The physical rebuilding came first. Shops that had been boarded up for weeks reopened their doors. The cafe hired new staff and extended its hours. The library added new books and started a community reading program. Even the town square, which had been eerily quiet during the crisis, began to fill with people again. Mark placed his tape recorder in the center of the square twice a week, inviting anyone who wanted to share their story. Not their secrets, but their truths, to speak into it. The recordings were transcribed and archived, becoming part of the town's official history, rather than its hidden shame. A new mural appeared on the side of Clara's cafe, painted by a local artist who had found her voice again after years of silence. It showed a young woman holding an open book, surrounded by silver trees whose roots and branches formed words: truth, forgiveness, memory, hope. Children began bringing Clara their stories, not the dark confessions of adults, but the bright, honest narratives of young lives just beginning to understand the world. Elders came to talk, sharing memories of the town's earlier days, helping to weave a complete picture of Eldridge's history that included both its shadows and its light. The silence that had characterized the town for generations was broken, replaced by the ordinary sounds of human connection: conversations, laughter, the rustle of turning pages, the soft murmur of shared stories. 6 months after the reckoning, Clara walked down Main Street in the golden light of evening, breathing in air that smelled of fresh bread from the bakery, ink from the reopened print shop, and the clean scent of rain that had fallen earlier in the day. The town was not perfect, healing never was, but it was real in a way it hadn't been for decades. She paused at the lot where the keeper of secrets had stood, now marked by a small garden that the town had planted together. At its center grew a single flower, black as midnight with veins of silver running through its petals, beautiful and strange and somehow perfect. Clara knelt beside it and placed her hand on the soil, feeling the warmth of life that had taken root in ground that had once been poisoned by secrets. The flower was a reminder that darkness, when faced honestly, could be transformed into something beautiful. That truth, however painful, was always preferable to the slow death of denial. She stood and continued her walk, past the library where evening reading groups were gathering, past the cafe where neighbors sat sharing coffee and stories, past the park where children played without fear. The town was healing, one conversation at a time, one truth at a time, one choice at a time. Behind her, the hollow rested in peaceful silence, not the oppressive quiet of suppressed secrets, but the gentle stillness of a story that had found its proper ending. The ancient hunger was satisfied, the debt was paid, and the cycle of shame and silence that had plagued Eldridge for generations had finally been broken. The hollow was quiet, but for the first time in generations, it was not empty. It was filled with the presence of truth acknowledged, forgiveness offered, and hope planted in soil that had been enriched by the courage of those who had chosen to face their darkness rather than flee from it. And in that quiet, in that fullness, Clara could hear the whisper of new stories beginning. Stories of people who had learned that they were worthy of love not despite their flaws, but because of their humanity. Stories of a town that had remembered how to breathe. The truth had bloomed wild and honest and beautiful, and it would continue to grow. The end.